Rome thought he was just another slave, destined to die in the blood-soaked arenas for their entertainment. But Spartacus was no ordinary gladiator. He refused to be a pawn in Rome's deadly games, and instead, he lit the flames of one of the greatest uprisings in history. What started as a desperate escape soon turned into a full-scale war, shaking the foundations of the Roman Republic. With thousands of warriors at his side, he did the unthinkable. He made Rome fear its own slaves. But how did he rise from captivity to challenge the most powerful empire in the world? And what was his ultimate fate? The man known to history as Spartacus was an individual of very obscure origin. Based on the fact that he was in the fighting prime of his life in the mid-70s BC, it is generally assumed that he was born sometime between 105 BC and 100 BC. A reference in the brief accounts of his early life to his probably being a member of the Mede tribe strongly suggests that he was born near the Strymon or Struma River in what is now western Bulgaria, a region known in ancient times as Thrace. Of his parents and family background absolutely nothing is known. Spartacus hailed from a part of the ancient world which lay on the fringes of the richer Mediterranean states of Greece. Thrace covers the section of the Balkans on the northern side of the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara, the waterways dividing the Balkans from Anatolia, the western side of modern-day Turkey. Thrace was the name of the wider region covering the small Turkish enclave where Istanbul sits today, the southeastern quadrant of what is now Bulgaria and the northeastern corner of modern-day Greece. There were a number of significant port towns here dominating the waterways between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, but the major power was the population of Thracian tribespeople who dominated the interior. These were fierce fighters, though they were considered to be foreign barbarians by the Greeks. In the late 6th century BC they had been briefly conquered by the Persian Empire as the Persians sought to expand into Greece, but after the invasion of mainland Greece failed in 479 BC, a Thracian warlord by the name of Teres successfully established an independent kingdom of Thrace ruled by a tribal confederation known as the Odrysians. He and his successors would dominate the Thrace region with the exception of the southern coastal region where a number of broadly independent cities and port towns predominated. However, there were periods during which the Odrysian kingdom was dominated by other regional powers such as the Kingdom of Macedon and the Empire of Alexander the Great from the middle of the 4th century BC onwards. Spartacus' story belongs to a different time period altogether, one during which new power dynamics had begun to operate in the wider world of the eastern Mediterranean. The conquests of Alexander the Great had spread Greek or Hellenic culture far and wide. The Odrysian kingdom of Thrace had remained a nominal part of the Kingdom of Macedon into the 3rd century BC, but as near constant conflicts raged between the successor kingdoms to Alexander's empire, notably the Kingdom of Macedon, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in the Levant. The Thracians largely became entirely independent again. They were aided in this process during the 2nd century BC when a new power began to emerge in the eastern Mediterranean. This was the Roman Republic, a state which during the 3rd century BC had conquered most of the western Mediterranean and was now being drawn into the wars of the East. Between the end of the 3rd century BC and 146 BC they fought a series of wars with the Kingdom of Macedon which saw that state utterly defeated. With their near-western neighbor decimated during these conflicts, the position of the Thracians, who first allied with Macedon against Rome but then switched sides, became more chaotic, with the Odrysian tribes suffering a decline and power fragmenting here. A new Thracian tribal group, the Sapians, would eventually emerge as a client state of Rome's, but Thrace during Spartacus' time was effectively a region on the borders of Rome, one experiencing severe political and military unrest and from which slaves were often being acquired as the spoils of war and conflict by the Romans. There are numerous sources available for the study of Spartacus' life and actions, though these are fragmentary in their coverage and provide little information on his birth, family background or early life, instead broadly focusing on his time as a slave and rebel leader within Roman Italy when he was already an adult in his mid to late 20s. These are all sources written by Roman and Greco-Roman writers. The most detailed is the account found in the life of Crassus written by the 2nd century AD Greco-Roman writer, Plutarch. Plutarch wrote dozens of biographies comparing the stories of ancient Greek and Roman politicians, lawmakers and military commanders. His Life of Crassus tells the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, a contemporary of Spartacus who was reputedly the wealthiest man in the Roman Republic during the first half of the 1st century BC, and thus a figure who had a claim to being the wealthiest individual in the whole world at that time. Crassus would play the central role. in commanding the Roman military suppression of Spartacus' slave revolt in the late 70s BC. In relating Crassus' story, Plutarch necessarily discussed Spartacus' revolt in considerable detail and also provided some backstory on who Spartacus was, though his work was written over 200 years after the events it describes and needs to be approached with some caution. There are several other important sources concerning Spartacus' life and actions. One of these was by a more obscure Roman historian, Publius Annius Florus, a figure understood to have lived around the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, a century and a half after Spartacus' time. Florus composed an epitomized or abbreviated version of the more well-known Roman historian Livy's vast history of Rome since its foundation. A significant enough passage of this work addresses Spartacus and the Third Servile Revolt that he led. More substantial still was the work of Appian of Alexandria, a Greco-Roman historian and contemporary of Plutarch. In one of his many works, The Civil Wars, a large work addressing the crisis, decline and fall of the Roman Republic roughly between 140 BC and 40 BC, there is a sizable section covering the slave revolt Spartacus led, one which provides some backstory on the Thracian. All of these works suffer from being written in or around 200 years after the events they described. Conversely, Sallust, a Roman historian of the 1st century BC, was alive at the time of the Third Servile War that Spartacus led, though he was just a child at the time. He is more well known today for composing 2 short histories on the Jugurthine War and the Catiline Conspiracy, but Sallust also authored a set of further histories. The majority of the text is unfortunately lost, but one of the fragments of it which has survived pertains to the revolt of Spartacus and his followers in southern Italy between 73 BC and 71 BC. These texts, along with a limited amount of archaeological evidence like inscriptions and material remains from excavation sites in southern Italy, are the primary basis for reconstructing the life of Spartacus to the degree that we can. One theory which has emerged concerning Spartacus and his background is based not so much on ancient sources which directly address the man himself, but is instead based on analysis of his name and whether it indicates some royal ancestry. Between the mid-5th century BC and the late 2nd century BC, right around the time Spartacus was born, the Spartacid dynasty ruled over the kingdom of the Cimmerian Bosporus, a state that dominated much of the Crimean Peninsula and nearby coastal regions on the eastern side of the Sea of Azov. 5 rulers of this kingdom, beginning with Spartokos I between 438 BC and 433 BC and ending with Spartokos V, who ruled for 2 decades between 200 BC and 180 BC, bore a name which is effectively the same as Spartacus though with a slightly variant spelling in modern translation. It has therefore been suggested that Spartacus may have been descended or in some way related to the Spartacid dynasty that ruled this kingdom on the northern side of the Black Sea and may have hailed from a branch of the family that established themselves in Thrace at some time in the 2nd century BC. It is a not entirely implausible supposition, though one based purely on the circumstantial evidence of his name and one which some observers have probably been a bit too willing to believe, with its romantic overtones of a young man of royal blood reduced to the status of a slave in Roman society and battling to free himself and return to his former life. What little evidence we do have concerning Spartacus' early life is very limited, but it is consistent. All of the ancient accounts of him agree that he was a Thracian. Plutarch described him as hailing from a nomadic tribe, information which was complemented by others who added that he came from the Mede tribe. These were quasi-nomadic pastoralists, and we can assume that if these details are true he lived a somewhat wandering early life, moving with his family and other kin around the southern Bulgarian countryside tending to sheep and other livestock. Plutarch also described him as being possessed of a great spirit and physical strength, something which would certainly make sense given his later position as both a soldier and a gladiator slave, while it is also from the Greco-Roman historical biographer that we learn that Spartacus was, quote, much more than one would expect from his condition, most intelligent and cultured, being more like a Greek than a Thracian. They say that when he was first taken to Rome to be sold, a snake was seen coiled round his head when he was asleep, and his wife, who came from the same tribe and was a prophetess subject to possession by the frenzy of the god of ecstasy Dionysus, declared that this sign meant that he would have a great and terrible power which would end in misfortune. We also have some limited details on his life as he became an adult in Thrace and how he managed to end up as a slave within the Roman Republic. Appian tells us that Spartacus was, quote, a Thracian who had once fought against the Romans. This view of the man as an individual who fought against a Roman incursion of some kind into Thrace is corroborated by other ancient writers, But unfortunately there is no further detail about it. It leaves us with more questions than answers. For instance, was Spartacus just a common soldier with a Thracian fighting band of some kind, or was he a leader amongst them who commanded a regiment of his fellow people? This is an important question, as, if we knew the answer to it, it would reveal much about how he met with such success against the Romans when he led his revolt in Italy many years later. Unfortunately, though, no further details are forthcoming from the available evidence. At the same time, we can assume that he must have been captured, perhaps after some battle or military defeat for the Thracians he fought with, around the early to mid-70s BC, and was soon sold into slavery in Italy after being sent there from Thrace. He most likely was not in captivity for many years before he appears on the historical record in 73 BC, as had he been a slave of long-standing Plutarch, Appian and others would have surely mentioned this in their otherwise very brief accounts of his backstory. Spartacus was now entering into slavery in the Roman world. This was a complicated existence. Slaves had virtually no rights or liberties of any kind, though their lives were often not as brutal as those who experienced the chattel and plantation slavery that prevailed in the Caribbean and southern states of the United States between the 17th and 19th centuries. For instance, many slaves in the Roman world were household servants, and if they had owners that treated them well, did not experience brutality. Still, they were unfree, though they could win their freedom through various mechanisms. There was the darker side of slavery though. If an owner was inclined to mistreat their slaves, their lives could be extremely difficult, and there is no shortage of evidence of slaves having to wear collars and fetters that indicated their enslaved status and called on anyone who apprehended them to return them to their owner. Because of the nature of the Mediterranean societies that Rome conquered from the 3rd century onwards and the nature of Roman imperialism itself, the Roman Republic was a state in which slavery was extremely common. Slaves were taken from each conquered region as the spoils of war, often with a huge proportion of a city or town that resisted Roman rule being enslaved afterwards. It is estimated that upwards of 20% of the population of the Roman Empire at its height were slaves. These were used in various capacities. Some were household slaves. The more educated might acquire positions as scribes and clerks and were considered valuable members of a patrician or wealthy individual staff and household. The less fortunate were menial laborers whose lives were spent carrying out hard labor in mines, quarries and building sites. Amongst these, gladiatorial slaves occupied a somewhat unusual position in that their lives could be short and violent, but if they succeeded as gladiators they could aspire to not only win their freedom, but also to live a life of riches and fame. Gladiators, whose name is derived from the gladius short sword that many fought with, were combatants who took part in the Ludi Romani or gladiatorial games that had become common in Rome from around the 3rd century BC onwards. By Spartacus' time they had become a staple of Roman life, and amphitheaters for holding gladiatorial contests were beginning to appear in many provincial cities and towns. Many gladiators were slaves, though some were volunteers who were eager to gain fame and renown by winning contests on the sands of the amphitheaters, while riches could also await particularly successful gladiators. Still, death was the outcome before long for many fighters, and as the Ludi Romani became more and more popular, a constant stream of slave gladiators was needed to replace those who had lost their lives fighting one another for the entertainment of the Roman people. The contests would go through peaks and valleys of popularity, with some later Roman emperors favoring the less violent sport of chariot racing instead, though in the politically turbulent and violent last century of the Roman Republic, which Spartacus lived right in the middle of, the gladiatorial contests were at the absolute peak of their popularity, with Roman generals and politicians managing gladiatorial schools and holding contests as a way of bolstering their own popularity with the wider Roman population. Slave gladiators like Spartacus became in the mid-70s BC were trained at a ludus, a gladiatorial school. These were relatively new innovations. The first ludus for which there is concrete evidence did not appear until the very end of the 2nd century BC, around 30 years before Spartacus was enslaved. The town of Capua and the surrounding region quickly became the center of such gladiatorial schools in Italy, as it lay in close enough proximity to the city of Rome to be able to transport gladiators there at short notice, while at the same time being far enough removed to provide extensive room for the school grounds and also to avoid violence spreading to the capital if a revolt occurred at a ludus, southern Italy having experienced numerous slave revolts already in the 2nd century BC. Excavations of major gladiatorial schools such as the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiatorial school built near the Colosseum in Rome in later centuries, reveals that barracks and dormitories were laid out for the slave gladiators. Water was piped into the ludus, and the living quarters were of a good quality. The diet of gladiators was also quite good, as they needed their strength to perform well, while expansive training grounds were laid out for gladiators to exercise and practice their fighting skills. Overall, slaves like Spartacus that found themselves being brought to a ludus could expect a higher living standard than most other slaves in Roman society, the catch being that their lives could be quite short depending on how they fought in the amphitheaters. Spartacus' potential as a gladiator was quickly realized following his enslavement and his arrival in Italy. Our ancient sources do not reveal much about how it came about, but we do know that he soon ended up at the gladiatorial school managed by Lentulus Batiatus, otherwise named as Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Vatia, in the town of Capua down the coast of western Italy from the city of Rome itself. Capua was an extremely important satellite of Rome, a major urban center between the capital and the rich settlements of southern Italy and a stopping point on the Appian Way, the great road the Romans had built through the region 2.5 centuries earlier. Batiatus may well have been the Cornelius Lentulus who successively served as quaestor and the tribune in Rome in 75 BC and 72 BC, and was consequently a figure of some considerable social prestige and wealth at the time Spartacus arrived at Capua. At the ludus here Spartacus was assigned to fight as a Gallus, a type of gladiator who fought with a large oblong shield and gladius sword and who were assigned the role of pretending to be a Gallic warrior from Gaul and France and the Low Countries, the Gallic people being formidable enemies of Rome who had been the last people to sack the city all the way back in 390 BC. These Gallus gladiators became known as a murmillo after the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar 2 decades later, when it became politically unacceptable to refer to the new subjects of Rome as individuals who would be sent to their death in the amphitheaters. Unfortunately, our sources provide almost no further information of any kind on Spartacus' life at Capua, but based on his decision to lead a breakout with other slaves from the ludus before long we can conjecture that conditions were not idyllic. Spartacus had ended up enslaved in a gladiatorial school of southern Italy during a period of long-running tensions within the world of the Romans. While the Roman Republic had entered into a period of conquest and expansion in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC of an unprecedented kind for a power from the western Mediterranean, power and riches had brought their own problems. Beginning in the 130s BC there were social and political problems in Rome itself, while by the dawn of the 1st century BC a growing problem was that of Roman military commanders becoming far too powerful and exercising excessive control within the Republic. Two camps had developed, one supporting a general named Gaius Marius and another, a younger upstart called Cornelius Sulla. Eventually Sulla had won a civil war against the Marians after the death of Marius himself, and had claimed the title of dictator in Rome for several years between 82 BC and 80 BC. When Spartacus arrived in Italy, the Republic was only just settling back into some form of normality after the civil war and dictatorship, with Sulla eventually having retired to his country estates, where he died not long afterwards. The sharks continued to circle the dying Roman Republic though, and the next half a century would see general after general trying to claim absolute power in Rome before an imperial system would finally be established by Caesar Augustus in 27 BC. This political crisis was mirrored in a social crisis which was much more germane to Spartacus' story. Rome, as we have seen, was a slave-owning society, one in which at its height an estimated 20% of the population were slaves. Beyond slaves themselves, a large proportion of the free population were the poor and landless laborers. It was only Roman citizens and in particular the Roman elite who held major wealth and benefited from the empire. This highly inegalitarian situation had led to both slave revolts and popular protests against Roman policies for decades. For instance, between 135 BC and 132 BC a huge slave rebellion occurred on the island of Sicily, one which saw much of the island come under the control of a slave army for years before being suppressed. It became known as the First Servile War. A second Servile War followed on Sicily as well between 104 BC and 100 BC, when the large slave population on the island took advantage of the invasion of northern Italy by the Cimbri and other enemies of Rome from beyond the Alps to try to carve out their own domain in Sicily. Finally, between 91 BC and 87 BC, the Social War, a clash between the Romans and their non-Roman Italianate subjects across Italy, was fought as the non-Roman, Italian people sought to be given the honors of Roman citizenship. What all of these conflicts point towards is that there was a strong tradition across Italy by the 70s BC of revolts against Roman rule, both from within the large slave community and the Italian free community, with Sicily and southern Italy in particular being places of frequent revolts and insurrections. When combined with the recent civil war between Sulla and the Marians, the political and social environment that Spartacus found in Italy in the mid-70s BC was febrile at best. Spartacus would soon lead a new slave revolt in southern Italy, one which eclipsed the First and Second Servile Wars in terms of the numbers involved and the threat it posed to the city of Rome itself. This began with an escape of several dozen slaves from the Ludus at Capua sometime in 73 BC. Plutarch provides the most detailed account of the events which initiated the slave revolt that would become known as the Third Servile War. In his Life of Crassus he relates the following: the rising of the gladiators and their devastation of Italy, which is generally known as the War of Spartacus, began as follows. A man called Lentulus Batiatus had an establishment for gladiators at Capua. Most of them were Gauls and Thracians. They had done nothing wrong, but simply because of the cruelty of their owner, were kept in close confinement until the time came for them to engage in combat. 200 of them planned to escape, but their plan was betrayed and only 78, who realized this, managed to act in time and get away, armed with choppers and spits which they seized from some cookhouse. On the road they came across some wagons which were carrying arms for gladiators to another city, and they took these arms for their own use. They then occupied a strong position and elected 3 leaders. The first of these was Spartacus. Elsewhere we learn that the Thracians' 2 co-leaders were the gladiator slaves Crixus and Oenomaus, while 2 slave gladiators from Gaul, Gannicus and Castus, would quickly become involved in leading the revolt as well. The slave breakout at Capua would spiral into a much wider revolt amongst the servile classes of Roman society in southern Italy. Spartacus and his allies headed south from Capua towards the city of Neapolis, modern-day Naples, and other settlements like Pompeii. As they did, more and more slaves and discontented individuals were drawn to their cause and their numbers swelled, first into the hundreds and eventually into the thousands. This process was facilitated as they began attacking and looting isolated Roman villas and small villages, then moving on to towns throughout the Campania region. They soon made their way to Mount Vesuvius, the great volcanic mountain overlooking Neapolis and the Bay of Naples, the one which a century and a half later would erupt violently and bury the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum under volcanic ash and rock. Here they made the slopes of the mountain a staging post where they began consolidating their forces into a makeshift army. The Romans were responding too though. No legions were allowed to be stationed in Italy under normal circumstances south of the river Rubicon, so it took some time for a major army to be raised. But in this initial stage of the Third Servile War a militia force of several thousand men under a Roman magistrate by the name of Gaius Claudius Glaber was sent south to deal with the insurrection. There Spartacus and his men used a novel strategy, rappelling down the steep sides of Mount Vesuvius on ladders and then flanking Glaber and his men in a surprise attack which led to a significant victory. With this, word spread that a new revolt against Roman oppression was underway in southern Italy and unrest gripped the region. The Third Servile War had begun with Spartacus as its leader. There are differing accounts as to how the Third Servile War which now began played out, with Appian and Plutarch disagreeing on a number of specific aspects of it. What is unanimously agreed upon is that this was a war which lasted for around 2.5 years between the original slave breakout from Capua and the Battle of Mount Vesuvius in 73 BC and when it would finally be suppressed late in 71 BC at the Battle of the Salarius River. Both ancient historians also agree that after a period of building up their forces to tens of thousands of men, Spartacus and the other rebel leaders moved to the eastern coast of southern Italy and then headed north along the eastern side of the Apennine Mountains that formed the spine of central Italy. Spartacus then won a considerable victory over the Romans at a site to the east of Rome, most likely in the vicinity of modern-day Pescara. Where they differ is that Appian holds that Spartacus then largely headed west and might have been attempting to strike at Rome itself before thinking better of this strategy and retreating back to southern Italy. Plutarch, by way of contrast, describes Spartacus and his men as venturing much further north towards Ravenna and Bologna, before fighting a victorious battle against the Romans at Mutina. According to the historical biographer in his Life of Crassus, he then headed south, but did not pass as close to Rome as Appian holds. Both accounts suggest these events occurred in 72 BC and that even as they were playing out the Romans were diverting a great number of legions back to Italy to crush the revolt. The culmination of it all would come in southern Italy in 71 BC. Throughout the accounts of Plutarch, Appian, Florus and others, it is entirely clear that Spartacus was viewed as the paramount leader of the slave rebels and their allies. The question of how close to the city of Rome Spartacus and his followers went raises questions as to what his objectives were and what the other leaders of the revolt hoped to achieve. After all, if they had simply wished to win their freedom, why did they not simply acquire some ships early on in the revolt and flee from Italy altogether? In an age when piracy was rife around the Mediterranean and the Romans were not yet masters of what they would later call Mare Nostrum, our sea, it might have been possible for Spartacus to make his way home to Thrace with a bit of luck. Florus argued that Spartacus and his earliest followers were initially motivated by nothing more than a desire to escape captivity. Later, as their efforts at Mount Vesuvius met with success and more men gravitated towards them and their numbers swelled, these aims mutated into a desire for revenge against the Roman people. Finally, he suggests that as their confidence grew, the Thracian began to entertain hopes of attacking the city of Rome itself. This is a neat explanation for Spartacus' actions, but there may have been other factors at play. For instance, some historians of the late Roman Republic argue that many thousands of those who joined the revolt were not in fact slaves and were instead former Roman soldiers or individuals with other resentments against the state. In this light, the Third Servile War is cast as a conflict in which slaves and others in southern Italy, who felt that they had not been properly rewarded for their role in the rapid expansion of the Republic in years gone by, banded together to punish the elite of Italy and to potentially grow their strength until they could strike at Rome itself. Appian's account of their progress, with a northward march and then abrupt swerve westwards close to Rome, suggests a possible objective of attacking the capital, though Plutarch, who as we have seen describes Spartacus and his followers as campaigning much further north towards the plain of Lombardy, hints that perhaps they were attempting to simply break out of Italy altogether to freedom over the Alps, where Gallic and German tribes still lived free from Roman rule. The theory that Spartacus' army was comprised of many former Roman loyalists who were disillusioned at the way they had been excluded from the benefits of empire would certainly fit with the size of the army that Spartacus was able to assemble. The ancient accounts concur that he was soon leading an army of tens of thousands of men in southern Italy, and it seems plausible that this was not made up of slaves alone. Historians estimate that the entire horde soon grew to 120,000 followers, but this included camp followers like women and auxiliaries and camp aides who did not fight. Nevertheless, it seems plausible that the rebel army reached a fighting capacity of as much as 70,000 or 80,000 men at its height in 72 BC. From Florus we hear how Spartacus and the other slave leaders built up their army. He states that their forces became, quote, a regular army by the daily arrival of fresh forces. They made themselves rude shields of wickerwork and the skins of animals, and swords and other weapons by melting down the iron in the slave prisons. That nothing might be lacking which was proper to a regular army, cavalry was procured by breaking in herds of horses which they encountered, and his men brought to their leader the insignia and fasces captured from the praetors. Throughout these events Spartacus and his men won several notable victories against the Romans. After the initial small force of hastily assembled troops under Glaber had been defeated at the Battle of Mount Vesuvius, another Roman magistrate and commander, the praetor, Publius Varinius, was ordered to gather together as many men as he could and head south. This was still in 73 BC, when the full scale of the threat posed by the rebels had not yet become apparent. Varinius' expedition met with even greater failure than had Glaber's. He marched with several thousand troops, so much so that he decided to split his forces into two contingents, a costly mistake which saw Spartacus' army defeat the two weaker contingents with ease. Varinius barely escaped alive, and most of his men were either killed or captured. This was a boon to the slave army, which now used the captured armor and weapons to arm themselves and strengthen their own forces. Then in the winter of 73 BC into 72 BC they conducted a series of raids against the principal towns and villages of the Campania region, including Nola, Metapontum, Thurii and Nuceria. In this way they continued to strengthen their own position. Further victories followed in the spring and summer of 72 BC, this time against greater forces. As Spartacus led his tens of thousands of followers north along the eastern side of the Italian peninsula, two much larger armies under the two consuls for 72 BC, the leaders of the Roman Republic elected on an annual basis, Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, moved to prevent them moving any further north. A battle occurred near Gargano in the Foggia region, one in which the Thracian and his men once again scored a victory. It now became apparent to the Senate in Rome that they were not going to be able to suppress the unrest in the south of Italy by sending small forces against Spartacus, and a much more concerted war using the extensive resources of the Roman state would be necessary. They would need full legions, and several of them. Thus did the call go out to the provinces for the governors and commanders there to begin dispatching their men towards Italy to protect the city of Rome itself. At the same time, these victories did not come with complete ease for the rebels. During these early engagements in the Third Servile War, Enemaus, one of the slave gladiators who had led the revolt since its earliest days alongside Spartacus, was killed, while the engagement against the consular armies near Gargano in 72 BC may have ended in victory but was costly all the same for the rebel armies. As legionaries began pouring into Italy from the provinces in the second half of 72 BC and into early 71 BC, 3 individuals were tasked with taking charge of them and crushing the war Spartacus had become the leader of. One of these was Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, a Roman proconsular governor of Macedonia who had been engaged in border wars in Spartacus' native Thrace in the early stages of the revolt and now arrived back in Italy with several legions. Another was Gnaeus Pompeius, a figure who had risen to prominence as a commander as a young man in his 20s during the civil war that brought Sulla briefly to power as dictator of the Roman Republic. In the course of the 70s BC, he had overseen the suppression of a lengthy revolt in Hispania by the Roman general Quintus Sertorius. Pompey, as he is more widely known, had just brought the Sertorian War to an end in 72 BC when he was recalled to Italy with some of his legions in response to the threat Spartacus posed there. But the most important Roman commander now, appointed by the Senate, was Marcus Crassus, Rome's wealthiest political figure. A clear indication of his critical role in the war against Spartacus is indicated by Plutarch's Life of Crassus being the most detailed ancient source we have for Spartacus' life and actions. Appian and Plutarch's accounts of the end of the war converge again and largely agree on the final stages of it. Having decided to march back to southern Italy with his forces, Spartacus was soon confronted by Crassus marching south with 8 legions, a nominal force of 40,000 well-trained men. In the now unlikely event that he should defeat these, Pompey and Lucullus were advancing in Crassus' rear with further legions. Despite the size of the revolt, there was now nearly parity when it came to the size of the two opposing armies. Perhaps the result was inevitable given this injection of legionaries into Italy. Crassus won a series of battles through the early months of 71 BC and by the second half of the year had hemmed Spartacus and his remaining army into the southwestern extremities of the peninsula. At this juncture Spartacus reached out to the great pirate leaders of Cilicia, a region in southern Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and according to Plutarch formed a deal with them whereby they would transport what remained of his forces across the Straits of Messina to Sicily, where he would reinvigorate his war by drawing tens of thousands of new recruits to his banner. The Cilicians, though, reneged on the agreement and Spartacus and his ever-declining band of followers were left stranded in the toe of Italy with Crassus, Pompey and Lucullus all advancing. Facing such insurmountable odds, Spartacus elected to try and engage with Crassus' forces before they were reinforced by Pompey or Lucullus. The final battle of the Third Servile War would take place at what was then known as the Salarius River in southern Italy, the modern-day Seal River, which runs through Battipaglia, a town to the south of Naples, Amalfi and Salerno on the Italian coastline. Like all parts of the war, we do not have an exact date for when it occurred, only that it took place late in 71 BC, perhaps around 2.5 years after the initial breakout by Spartacus and his comrades from the gladiator school at Capua, with Appian describing it as lasting close to 3 years. In keeping with the tendency that was common amongst ancient Greek and Roman historians to exaggerate the size of enemy armies, the sources for the battle suggest that Spartacus was still in command of over 50,000 men and outnumbered Crassus' legions, but modern historians tend to agree that Spartacus' army was probably down to 20,000 to 30,000 men at this juncture. Moreover, they were hemmed in. A new archaeological study, details of which have only been published in the summer of 2024, purports to have found the remains of a 2.5-kilometer-long wall in the Doswan dell'Emilia forest in Calabria, which Crassus and his men seem to have built to surround Spartacus' army. Outnumbered and facing better trained and resourced legions that were effectively encircling them with these quickly erected fortifications, the slave army had no option but to engage the Romans and were soundly defeated. Thousands perished, though not without inflicting heavy enough casualties on the Romans. This possibly being a product of Crassus engaging Spartacus faster than he should have in an effort to bring the war to an end before either Pompey or Lucullus could steal some of the glory for defeating the Thracian from him. In the midst of the battle of the Salarius River, the Thracian slave gladiator that led the Third Servile War was killed. Appian provides a detailed account of Spartacus' death during the battle, relating how, quote, Spartacus himself was wounded by a spear thrust in the thigh, but went down on one knee, held his shield in front of him, and fought off his attackers until he and a great number of his followers were encircled and fell. The rest of his army was already in disorder and was cut down in huge numbers. Consequently, their losses were not easy to estimate, though the Romans lost about 1,000 men, and Spartacus' body was never found. Florus simply tells us that he fell during the battle, though interestingly, for a Roman writer describing the actions of a barbarian enemy, he praises the gladiator general for falling while fighting bravely on the front lines as a general. This positive account of the manner in which the Thracian met his demise was mirrored by Plutarch, who gave the most detailed account of all of how Spartacus met his end. Here he describes the rebel general as slaying his own horse in the midst of the battle, declaring that if they won the battle he would have many Roman horses to choose from, and if they lost he would need none. Then he charged with a cohort of followers towards Crassus. He never made it to the Roman general though. Instead, after slaying many Romans, including 2 centurions, Spartacus' followers began to abandon him as the result of the wider battle became clear. Undismayed, Spartacus continued his charge, only to be cut down by the Romans before he could make it to Crassus. Plutarch's description of Spartacus' death, written more than 2 centuries after the events it purports to describe and nevertheless alleging to produce an eyewitness account of the scene, must be taken with a large pinch of salt. While it is possible that he himself was drawing on more contemporary sources that could reliably have described the battle and the death of the general, it is far more plausible that he was exercising a degree of creative license which makes his portrayal of Spartacus' death more historical fiction than historical reality. Spartacus' body was apparently never recovered from the battlefield following the Battle of the Salarius River. The engagement brought the Third Servile War to an end as Pompey, who had not brought his legions to aid Crassus in the actual battle, now moved to engage several divisions of the rebel army and slew thousands more in the hours and days that followed. He also sent word to Rome where he informed the Senate of the victory in a manner which allowed him to try and claim most of the credit for the victory that Crassus had won. For his part, Crassus engaged in a brutal conclusion to the war. He captured some 6,000 of the remaining rebels and crucified them at regular intervals along the 200-kilometer stretch of the main road between Capua and Rome, the famous Appian Way. Crucifixion was an already well-established form of capital punishment in the Roman Republic, one which involved the nailing of a condemned individual to a cross by the hands and feet until they bled to death or starved. This grisly punishment would have been designed as a form of exemplary deterrence, with slaves all over Italy relating stories of the vicious end suffered by those who had revolted against their owners and defied the power of the Roman state. It was a brutal end to the revolt of Spartacus. The Third Servile War had implications for slave ownership and slavery in general in Italy during the era of the late Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. Some classical scholars have argued that there was an improvement in the conditions slaves lived in and their treatment of them by their owners from the middle of the 1st century BC onwards, and that this may have been owing to residual fears about a potential Fourth Servile War and the threat to free Romans that Spartacus' war had posed between 73 BC and 71 BC. There was also a marked increase in the use of free labor to carry out a range of tasks across Italy, particularly working on rural estates in the early imperial period, a development which may have been due to increased fears about having large numbers of slaves on estates here. This was possibly caused by other developments though. The era of major Roman conquests, for instance, ended just a few decades later during the era of Emperor Caesar Augustus as he decided to consolidate Rome's territorial empire rather than expand it. Without endless conquests that ended in mass enslavements of subjugated people, Rome's supply of abundant and cheap slaves dried up, leading to better treatment of existing slaves. Hence, Spartacus' revolt was just one factor in the improved conditions slaves lived in under the early Roman Empire. While the Third Servile War ended with individuals like Spartacus and his many allies paying the ultimate price, either falling in battle or being crucified as a warning to any potential future slave rebels, the suppression of it was the making of Marcus Crassus' political career. For a time, in the early stages of the war, the slave revolt had presented an enormous threat to the safety of Rome itself and the villas of the rich elites scattered across the Italian countryside. In using his immense wealth to quickly arm and supply the legions which he then led south to crush the insurrection, Crassus acquired the legitimacy he had sought since the downfall of Sulla and managed to emerge from the military campaign with a greater share of the credit for crushing it than Pompey did. He would go on to hold several senior political offices at Rome in the 60s BC. Meanwhile, Pompey went on to lead an immensely successful military campaign to the eastern Mediterranean in the early 60s BC, one which over the course of several years saw the final annexation of the lands of the Seleucid Empire there, the military defeat of Rome's bitterest eastern enemy, King Mithridates of Pontus in what is now northern Turkey, and the diplomatic realignment of the region to make powers like the Kingdom of Judea into full-fledged Roman client states. In the process, the Kingdom of Thrace would also become a satellite of Rome. Eventually, towards the end of the 60s BC, Crassus and Pompey began to form a political alliance along with another rising young politician, Gaius Julius Caesar. The first triumvirate, which became public knowledge in 59 BC, provided the basis for the three men to wield power in the Republic between them. When it collapsed years later, Rome descended into civil war again. It is notable that two of the three individuals involved rose considerably in the political life of the Roman Republic owing to the Third Servile War that Spartacus led. Spartacus' revolt and the Third Servile War would inspire many other slave revolts and political movements against overt oppression over the centuries and millennia that followed. There would be nothing comparable to it again in Roman times, with the Third Servile War being the last of the three such conflicts to occur in the late Roman Republic. Other cultures and time periods produced far more successful ones. For instance, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt was born there in the middle of the 13th century out of a slave revolt when the Mamluk slaves of the Arab rulers managed to gain control over the country and establish their own polity. Similarly, there were a great many different slave revolts throughout the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. One of these, the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s and 1800s, would eventually lead to the establishment of the first nation-state in the New World ruled by black people whose ancestors had been brought to the Americas as slaves. One of the main early leaders of the revolt against the French on Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, consciously viewed himself as a latter-day Spartacus. In a somewhat different vein, when German communist agitators led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht launched a revolt against the centrist government of Germany in Berlin in January 1919, their attempted revolution became known as the Spartacist Uprising in recognition that they had founded a group called the Spartacus League back in 1914. Thus, Spartacus has remained an inspiration for slave revolts and movements against political and social oppression down to modern times, and his name has accordingly been co-opted as such. Spartacus has also emerged as a culturally significant individual, with his story retold in many different formats in modern times. For instance, as early as 1874, the Italian author, Raffaello Giovagnoli, published a book entitled Spartacco, while the great German cultural critic and playwright, Bertolt Brecht, made Spartacus the subject of the second play he ever completed. Less than 20 years later, the Hungarian author, Arthur Koestler, published his first book in English, The Gladiators. It focused on the revolt of Spartacus and his followers, and was notably the book Koestler wrote right before he began work on Darkness at Noon. The latter is widely considered one of the great novels of the 20th century, and with its anti-totalitarian themes, Koestler's recent work before writing it on a group of slaves revolting against the oppression of their Roman owners was doubtlessly an influence. Another 2 decades later, the film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas in the title role and Laurence Olivier as Marcus Crassus, appeared. Based on a 1951 book by Howard Fast, the film was directed by the great Stanley Kubrick and won several Academy Awards, including a nod to Peter Ustinov for his depiction of Batiatus, the owner of the gladiatorial school in Capua where the revolt that launched the Third Servile War began. Further television series have retold the story of Spartacus in recent decades. Though less critically lauded, they point towards the continuing interest in the slave leader's story and the war he led against Rome between 73 BC and 71 BC. Spartacus is a very interesting historical figure. Rattle off the name today, and almost anyone you meet will have either heard of it before and might even be familiar with the broad parameters of his story. He was the leader of a slave revolt against the might of the Roman state, a romantic figure whose story has been retold repeatedly in books, films, television series and plays over the centuries. And yet, when we dig down beyond the romantic tale, we actually know virtually nothing about Spartacus. The amount of written source material concerning his life and the revolt which he led against Rome, the Third Servile War, found in the works of Plutarch, Appian, Florus and a handful of other fragments, stretches to just a few thousand words when compiled together. These provide little more than a few sentences about his early life and backstory, and other than some conjecture about his possible ancestry, we know almost nothing about him other than that he hailed from Thrace and after fighting against the Roman state was enslaved and ended up at a gladiatorial school in Capua in the mid-70s BC. Thereafter we have a good bit more detail on the 2 or so years between when he and his accomplices initiated the Third Servile War and when he died fighting at the end of it. It must be said that it was an heroic struggle. For 2.5 years a gang of men who were enslaved and oppressed managed to turn a small local revolt into a full-blown war in which they took over southern Italy and threatened the security of the city of Rome itself, drawing tens of thousands of men to their banner in the process. Even those Roman historians who wrote about Spartacus expressed admiration for his bravery. But his cause was ultimately doomed and the war was crushed brutally in 71 BC. In the end, perhaps the reason why Spartacus has been so easy to romanticize is that we know so little about him. All that really exists is the colorful fable of an obscure slave who revolted against a great power, threatened it for a brief time and then died valiantly in battle. What do you think of Spartacus? Was he a major slave leader and social upstart, or has his rebellion simply been romanticized by Hollywood since the middle of the 20th century? Spartacus was more than just a gladiator. He was a symbol of defiance against oppression. He led an army of the forgotten, the enslaved, the ones Rome believed had no power. For years, he outwitted the greatest military force of his time, proving that even the mightiest empire could be shaken. But in the end, Rome struck back with overwhelming force. His final battle was brutal, his army scattered, and his body was never found. Yet, Spartacus never truly died. His legacy lived on, inspiring revolutions and freedom fighters for centuries to come. The gladiator who rose against Rome became more than a man, he became a legend. Few figures in history ignite as much passion and controversy as Karl Marx. To some, he was a visionary, the father of modern socialism, a man who dared to challenge the economic systems that had shaped the world for centuries. To others, he was the architect of destruction, whose ideas fueled some of the most oppressive regimes in history. But regardless of how he is seen, one fact is undeniable: his theories changed the world. Marx was not a ruler. He did not lead armies. He never held political office. And yet, more than a century after his death, his name still stirs debate. His ideas have led to revolutions, toppled governments, and shaped the lives of billions. Nations have risen and fallen in his name. And even today, as the world faces economic inequality, political unrest, and corporate domination, his theories continue to resurface. But who was Karl Marx really? Was he a misunderstood intellectual whose ideas were twisted by those who followed him? Or were his theories always destined to lead to chaos? To answer that, we must go back, not just to his writings, but to the world that shaped him, the struggles that defined him, and the vision that made him one of the most divisive philosophers in history. The world Karl Marx was born into was one of extremes. On the surface, Europe in the early 19th century was thriving. The Industrial Revolution had transformed economies, bringing new technologies, railways, and factories. Cities grew rapidly, and wealth poured into the hands of the elite. It was an age of unprecedented economic expansion, where fortunes were made overnight, and industrial empires were built from nothing. But beneath this progress lay a dark and brutal reality. The very machines that powered industry also trapped millions in endless cycles of poverty. Factory workers toiled for 16 hours a day in hazardous conditions, their lungs filled with soot, their hands scarred from relentless labor. Child labor was common, with boys and girls as young as 6 working in mines and textile mills, their lives spent in near servitude for the profit of the wealthy elite. The ruling class, made up of aristocrats and industrialists, lived in luxury. Their wealth was built on the backs of laborers who barely survived on starvation wages. It was a world where a small group controlled nearly everything, while the masses struggled to survive. The rich were growing richer, and the poor were growing more desperate. And beneath the surface, something was boiling, a sense of injustice that would one day explode into revolution. Karl Marx was born into this world on May 5, 1818, in Trier, a small city in what is now Germany. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a respected lawyer, well-educated and wealthy enough to provide his son with the best education available. Young Karl was brilliant, excelling in studies of law, philosophy, and history. But unlike his classmates, he did not dream of wealth or political power. Instead, he was drawn to the struggles of the common people, the workers, the poor, the ones who suffered while others thrived. It was during his years as a student in Berlin that Marx's radicalization began. He immersed himself in the works of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a philosopher who argued that history was shaped by struggle. Marx took this idea further. He believed history was not just shaped by ideas, but by economic forces, by class conflict, by the battle between the rich and the poor. This belief would define the rest of his life. But how does a man go from being a student of philosophy to becoming the most feared thinker of his time? Karl Marx was never content with simply discussing ideas. He wanted action. He saw poverty, suffering, and injustice, and he believed that the only way to change the world was through revolution. He began writing articles for radical newspapers, attacking the government, criticizing capitalism, and calling for workers to rise against their oppressors. His words were sharp, his arguments relentless. And they did not go unnoticed. By the time Marx was in his mid-20s, he had already been forced to flee Germany. His writings had made him a target. The authorities saw him as dangerous, a threat to the existing order. But exile did not stop him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. In Paris, he found himself at the center of a radical intellectual community, surrounded by anarchists, socialists, and revolutionaries. It was here that he met Friedrich Engels, the man who would become his closest collaborator, his co-author, and the financier of his most important works. Engels was the son of a wealthy industrialist, but unlike his father, he despised the system that made him rich. He had seen firsthand the brutal conditions of factory workers and believed Marx was right. Capitalism was built on exploitation. Together, Marx and Engels began to refine their ideas, developing what would become known as scientific socialism, a theory that claimed history was moving toward an inevitable revolution. They believed that capitalism, no matter how powerful it seemed, would eventually collapse under its own weight. The working class, driven to desperation, would rise up, overthrow the ruling elite, and create a new system where wealth was shared equally. But their ideas were not just theories. They were a call to action. And soon, they would put their vision into words that would shake the world. By the mid-1840s, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had developed a radical vision that challenged everything about the world they lived in. They believed that history was not driven by ideas or kings but by class struggle, the constant battle between the ruling elite and the working masses. Marx argued that the rich did not simply earn their wealth, it was built by exploiting the labor of the working class. In 1847, they were approached by a group called the Communist League, a secret organization of revolutionaries. The League had a simple request. Marx and Engels needed to write a document that explained their vision of communism in clear, direct language. A revolutionary manifesto that could inspire workers across Europe to rise up. The result was the Communist Manifesto, a 23-page pamphlet that would change the world. It was published in February 1848, and it was nothing short of a declaration of war. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. With this opening line, Marx made it clear. Human civilization had always been about one thing, the fight between those who have power and those who don't. He claimed that capitalism was just another phase of history, and like the feudal lords before them, the ruling class, whom he called the bourgeoisie, would one day be overthrown by the proletariat, the working class. The manifesto did not just predict revolution, it called for it. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. These words would echo across history. But at the time, Marx and Engels had no idea just how much impact they would have. Just weeks after the pamphlet was published, revolution broke out across Europe. The year 1848 saw a wave of uprisings that spread like wildfire across the continent. In France, Italy, Germany, and Austria, workers took to the streets, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and the right to vote. Kings were overthrown, governments collapsed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Marx's predictions were coming true. But revolutions are not won with words alone. Despite the initial victories, the uprisings were crushed one by one. Monarchs and ruling elites, shocked by the scale of the protests, struck back with overwhelming force. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. By the end of the year, the old order had been restored. For Marx, this was a brutal lesson. The Communist Manifesto had predicted the rise of the working class, but it had not anticipated the power of the ruling elite to strike back. Marx had hoped that workers would overthrow capitalism in one great uprising. Instead, they had been divided, disorganized, and ultimately defeated. Marx himself was now a hunted man. He was expelled from Belgium, then Germany, then France. By 1849, he found himself in London, the capital of the British Empire, a city filled with wealth, industry, and poverty beyond imagination. Exile, however, did not mean defeat. If anything, it gave Marx more time to refine his theories. And from the shadows, he began writing the book that would define his legacy. Living in poverty in London, Marx devoted himself to his most ambitious work yet, a complete, scientific analysis of capitalism itself. He spent years studying the economy, reading reports, analyzing market trends, and tracking how wealth moved through society. What he discovered would become Das Kapital, his most famous and influential book. Published in 1867, Das Kapital was not a call to revolution like the Communist Manifesto. Instead, it was a massive, deeply analytical work, one that sought to prove why capitalism would inevitably collapse. Marx argued that capitalism was built on a fundamental contradiction. It needed workers to produce goods, but it also needed to keep wages low to maximize profit. This, he claimed, would lead to inequality, economic crises, and eventually revolution. He introduced the concept of surplus value. The idea that capitalists became rich by paying workers less than the true value of their labor. He explained how businesses would compete against each other, driving wages lower, forcing companies to expand, and creating a system where wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, and capitalism will dig its own grave. To many, this was a terrifying prophecy. To others, it was a brilliant insight into the mechanics of wealth and power. But Das Kapital was not an instant success. In fact, it was barely read at the time of its publication. It was long, complex, and filled with economic theories that most workers could not understand. Yet, Marx was convinced that history was on his side. "I am not writing for today," he once said. "I am writing for the future." And he was right. Because while Das Kapital did not spark revolutions in his lifetime, it would become the foundation of every communist movement in the 20th century. But Marx would not live to see it. His health was failing, his finances were in ruins, and despite his fame among revolutionaries, he died in near obscurity in 1883. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, his grave marked with the words, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world, in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." But Marx's story did not end with his death. In fact, it was just beginning. Because the ideas he left behind would soon spread across the world, leading to revolutions, the rise of superpowers, and some of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The rise of Marxism after his death. Karl Marx died in 1883, largely unnoticed by the world. He had no government power, no army, no political office. And yet, his ideas would soon spread farther than even he could have imagined. By the late 19th century, socialist movements were growing across Europe. Workers, inspired by Marx's vision, were demanding better wages, shorter hours, and the right to vote. Labor unions, once weak and ignored, were now forcing governments to listen. Socialists were being elected into parliaments, passing new laws to protect workers from exploitation. But Marx's vision was never about reform, it was about revolution. And that revolution was coming. The first major sign of Marx's influence appeared in Russia. Under the rule of the Tsars, the Russian Empire was a land of extreme wealth and crushing poverty. While aristocrats lived in luxury, millions of peasants and factory workers lived in filth, barely surviving. One man saw an opportunity. His name was Vladimir Lenin, and he believed that Marx's vision could become reality. Unlike Marx, Lenin was not content with waiting for capitalism to collapse on its own. He wanted action. In 1917, in the chaos of World War I, Lenin and his followers, known as the Bolsheviks, seized power in Russia, overthrowing the Tsar and establishing the first Marxist state. For the first time in history, a government ruled in the name of Marx's ideas. But was this the workers' paradise Marx had envisioned? Or was something darker emerging? The Russian Revolution was just the beginning. Marx's ideas now had a home, a government that could spread them across the globe. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, pushed Marxism further than ever before. Private property was abolished, industries were taken over by the state, and class divisions were supposed to disappear. But the reality was different. Instead of empowering workers, the Soviet Union became a brutal dictatorship. Stalin ruled with an iron fist, purging anyone who opposed him, sending millions to prison camps in Siberia. The revolution that had started with dreams of equality had turned into a nightmare of oppression. Yet, despite the horrors of Stalinism, Marxism continued to spread. China, 1949, Mao Zedong led a communist revolution, overthrowing the government and creating a new Marxist state. Cuba, 1959, Fidel Castro took power, inspired by Marx and Lenin, challenging the dominance of the US in the Western Hemisphere. Vietnam, Korea, Eastern Europe, one by one, nations turned red, embracing Marx's ideas in different forms. By the mid-20th century, nearly half the world lived under governments that claimed to follow Marxist principles. The Cold War began, a global conflict between capitalism and communism, between the US and the Soviet Union. The battle was not just about military power, it was a battle of ideas. But was this what Karl Marx had wanted? Or had his theories been twisted beyond recognition? By the 1980s, the cracks in the Marxist world were starting to show. The Soviet Union, once powerful, was struggling. Its economy was collapsing, its people were restless, and its leaders were out of touch. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the end of communism in Eastern Europe. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, bringing an end to the world's largest Marxist state. China, though still officially communist, had taken a different path. Under Deng Xiaoping, China embraced capitalism while maintaining tight political control. The economy boomed, lifting millions out of poverty, but at the cost of political freedom. By the 21st century, most of the world had abandoned Marxist-style communism. Capitalism had won. Or had it? Even today, Marx's ideas remain relevant. His critiques of capitalism, rising inequality, corporate control, economic crises, are still debated. In countries across the world, politicians and activists still invoke his name, arguing that capitalism is failing and that a new system is needed. So the question remains: was Karl Marx right all along? Or was he the most dangerous philosopher in history? More than 140 years after his death, Karl Marx remains one of the most discussed thinkers in history. Some argue that his ideas were deeply flawed, leading to economic failure and oppressive regimes. But others insist that Marx was not wrong, he was simply ahead of his time. His greatest prediction was that capitalism would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. He argued that the system would concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands, leaving the majority struggling. Today, critics of capitalism point to growing wealth inequality, the dominance of corporate monopolies, and the rise of automation replacing workers as proof that Marx's warnings were accurate. Marx believed that capitalism's greatest flaw was its inability to provide stability. He described the boom and bust cycles, periods of economic growth followed by devastating crashes, leaving millions unemployed. The financial crisis of 2008, where reckless corporate greed led to a global recession, is often cited as an example of Marx's theories in action. Even today, movements calling for higher wages, universal health care, and wealth redistribution echo Marx's vision of a world without economic exploitation. His ideas are still alive in political debates, academic discussions, and protests around the world. But if Marx's analysis of capitalism was correct, does that mean his solution, communism, was the right answer? While many agree that Marx was a brilliant critic of capitalism, his solutions remain deeply controversial. The 20th century saw multiple nations attempt to implement his vision, and the results were often catastrophic. The Soviet Union, what began as a Marxist-inspired revolution, led to one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Under Stalin, millions were sent to labor camps, political dissenters were executed, and the government controlled every aspect of life. Mao's China, the attempt to rapidly industrialize under communism led to the Great Famine, where over 30 million people starved to death, one of the worst human-made disasters in history. Cambodia's killing fields, the Khmer Rouge inspired by Marxist thought, attempted to create a classless society by forcing people into labor camps. Nearly a quarter of the population was killed in the process. Critics argue that Marx's ideas are too idealistic, ignoring basic human nature. They claim that eliminating private property and centralizing power in the hands of the state leads not to equality, but to dictatorship. But defenders of Marx argue that these governments misinterpreted his ideas. Marx never described exactly how communism should be implemented, he only analyzed capitalism. So, was the failure of communism a result of Marx's ideas themselves, or their misuse by those in power? Despite the failures of past communist states, Marxism has not disappeared. In fact, in recent years, interest in his ideas has surged. In the wake of economic crises, rising inequality and corporate dominance, many activists are revisiting Marx's critique of capitalism. Politicians in countries like the US, the UK and across Europe have proposed socialist policies like higher taxes on the wealthy, free healthcare, and workers' rights reforms, often citing Marxist thought. New movements, such as democratic socialism, attempt to mix Marxist ideals with modern democracy, arguing that the state can regulate capitalism rather than destroy it completely. Others believe Marx's concept of class struggle is playing out in modern debates about race, gender, and wealth distribution. But critics warn that history has already tested these ideas, and they failed. They argue that capitalism has survived precisely because it can evolve, unlike rigid Marxist states. So, is the world heading toward another Marxist revolution? Or will his ideas remain just a theory, a warning from history, rather than a blueprint for the future? Regardless of the answer, one fact remains. Karl Marx changed the world. But was it for better or worse? And is his revolution still to come? For over 150 years, Karl Marx's ideas have shaped history, inspired revolutions, and ignited endless debate. His vision was clear: a world where workers were no longer exploited, where wealth was shared, where capitalism would collapse under its own weight. But did his predictions come true? Some say yes. They point to the growing gap between the rich and poor, the rise of corporate monopolies, and the increasing struggle of workers in the modern world. They argue that Marx saw the future long before anyone else. That capitalism has become exactly what he warned about, a system that thrives on inequality. Others say no. They argue that Marx's ideas failed every time they were put into practice. That his theories ignored human nature, leading to brutal regimes and economic disasters. That capitalism, despite its flaws, has adapted, evolved, and lifted millions out of poverty in ways Marx could never have predicted. But whether you agree with him or not, one thing is undeniable: Karl Marx's ideas are still alive. His theories continue to fuel political debates, inspire social movements, and challenge the economic order of the world. So, as we look around at the modern world, rising economic inequality, global financial crises, automation replacing jobs, and protests demanding change, the real question is not whether Karl Marx was right or wrong. The real question is, are his ideas making a comeback? Because history has shown us one thing: revolutions never truly end. And Marx's revolution may still be waiting. Engaging the audience and the next chapter. Karl Marx remains one of the most divisive figures in history. Some see him as a visionary, a man who fought for justice and equality. Others see him as a dangerous thinker, whose ideas led to some of the darkest chapters in history. But what do you think? Was Karl Marx a prophet of the working class, or was he responsible for some of history's greatest disasters? Was his vision of a classless society realistic, or was it doomed to fail from the start? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this journey through history fascinating, be sure to check out our deep dive into the Russian Revolution, how Marx's ideas took over a nation. A story of revolution, betrayal, and power struggles. Click here to watch now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode of our deep explorations into history's greatest thinkers and most controversial ideas. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what happens next. The year is 1715. The Palace of Versailles stands in all its glory, bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. The gardens stretch as far as the eye can see, symmetrical, perfect, like a vision from a dream. Fountains dance with crystal water, statues of gods and kings cast long shadows across the pathways. Servants whisper as they hurry along the marble corridors. The scent of roses lingers in the air, but so does something else, something darker. Inside the gilded walls of the palace, behind the silk curtains and golden furniture, a man lies dying. His face, once proud and commanding, is now pale and gaunt. His breath is shallow, each inhale a struggle. His body is racked with pain, rotting from within. Gangrene has claimed his leg, and death is closing in. But his eyes, they still burn. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who ruled France for 72 years. He is the longest reigning monarch in European history. A king who made himself the very symbol of absolute power. For over 7 decades, his word was law. He bent the nobility to his will, defied his enemies in battle, and transformed France into the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But the glory came at a price. His wars drained the treasury. His palaces consumed fortunes. His people suffered under the weight of taxes and hunger. And now, as he faces his final moments, the future of his kingdom is uncertain. Louis XIV had built an empire of gold and marble, but beneath the surface lay cracks that would one day swallow his dynasty whole. How did a young boy, scarred by rebellion and fear, rise to become the most powerful king in Europe? How did he turn his reign into a golden age of culture, art, and power, while planting the seeds of a revolution that would bring the monarchy to its knees? And what was the true cost of his pursuit of glory? The price paid by his people, his family, and even himself. To understand the Sun King, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when Louis was not yet a god, but a child, hunted, afraid, and powerless. Because before he built Versailles, before he wore the crown with divine authority, Louis XIV was just a boy who would watch his enemies storm the gates of his home and swear that one day, no one would ever defy him again. This is the story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who built France's golden age, and in doing so, sealed its fate. Louis XIV's journey to power began not in splendor, but in fear. Born on September 5, 1638, at the royal chateau in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, he was the long-awaited heir to the French throne. His parents, King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria, had struggled for over 20 years to produce an heir. For decades, the royal marriage had been cold, distant, marked by political tensions and personal indifference. The arrival of Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given, was seen as a divine gift, a miracle sent by heaven to secure the future of France. Church bells rang out across the kingdom, and the people rejoiced. But the boy who would one day call himself the Sun King was born into a kingdom on the verge of chaos. France in the early 17th century was a kingdom divided and unstable. For decades, the country had been torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, as they were known in France. Though the Edict of Nantes, signed in 1598, had brought an uneasy peace, the scars of conflict still ran deep. The nobility, the great families of France, held enormous power. These lords controlled vast estates like miniature kingdoms, with private armies and the loyalty of thousands of peasants. Many of them saw the monarchy as little more than a rival, not a master. And the king himself? Louis XIII was a cautious and often distant ruler, heavily influenced by his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, a man feared as much as he was respected. Richelieu's goal was to strengthen the monarchy by weakening the power of the nobles and the Huguenots. He waged wars abroad and crushed dissent at home. But his methods bred resentment that would explode after his death. When Louis XIII died in 1643, Louis XIV was just 4 years old. The crown passed to this fragile child, but power did not. The real ruler of France was his mother, Queen Anne, who acted as regent, and her trusted advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. Together, Anne and Mazarin sought to continue Richelieu's work, tightening the monarchy's grip on power. But the nobility had grown restless. The boy king was not feared. His mother was a foreigner, Austrian, distrusted. And Mazarin was seen as a greedy outsider, an Italian who drained the kingdom's wealth to fund endless wars. Whispers of rebellion began to spread. And soon, Those whispers became shouts. Because before Louis could ever wear the crown as the Sun King, he would first have to survive the darkest chapter of his life, a rebellion that would nearly tear France apart. It was called the Fronde. And it would haunt him forever. The Fronde. A name that would come to define Louis XIV's childhood, and shape his vision of power for the rest of his life. The year was 1648. The 30 Years' War still raged across Europe, and France was stretched thin, financially drained, its armies scattered. Cardinal Mazarin, desperate for funds to maintain France's power, imposed new taxes on the nobles and the Parliament of Paris. But this time, the nobles refused to bow. They rallied their forces, leading the people of Paris into open revolt. It began as a demand for rights, but quickly became something far more dangerous, a fight for control over the kingdom. The streets of Paris became battlegrounds. Barricades were built. Royal officials were attacked. Palaces were besieged. And in the midst of this chaos was Louis, just 10 years old, watching as his kingdom seemed to crumble around him. One night, as the mob pressed against the gates of the royal palace, the young king was woken from his sleep. His mother held his hand, her face pale but determined. They fled the palace under cover of darkness, slipping past the angry crowds, escaping Paris like criminals. Louis hid in cold, unfamiliar rooms in distant fortresses, listening to the sounds of rebellion in the distance, hearing his name shouted by men who wanted him dead. The boy who was supposed to rule by divine right was now a fugitive, powerless, frightened. For years, the Fronde dragged on. Alliances shifted. Betrayals were common. Noble families fought not just against the crown, but against each other, turning France into a chaotic chessboard. Mazarin fought back with cunning and gold, bribing enemies, turning rivals into allies. But Louis saw it all, the deception, the bloodshed, the fragile nature of power. He learned that trust was dangerous. That mercy was weakness. Most importantly, he learned that no king was truly safe. By 1653, Mazarin had crushed the rebels, but the damage was done. Louis XIV had been scarred. The memory of fleeing his own palace, of hiding in fear, would stay with him for the rest of his life. And he made a vow, never again. Never again would the nobility challenge the king. Never again would Paris rise against him. Never again would he be at the mercy of anyone. When Louis XIV finally took power as an adult, he ruled with this lesson etched into his soul. He would not share power. He would not compromise. He would be absolute. And he would make sure that everyone, noble, peasant and foreign king alike, knew that Louis XIV was not just a ruler. He was the state. And the state would bow to him. Louis XIV had survived the Fronde. He had seen the limits of power. He had seen the nobility defy the crown. He had seen the people rise in anger. He had felt what it was like to be vulnerable, to be a king without power. And he swore that it would never happen again. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, Louis was 22 years old. For the first time, he stood alone at the head of the French state. Everyone in court expected him to appoint a new chief minister, another figure to govern in his name. But Louis shocked them all. He summoned his ministers, his generals and his advisers, and with calm confidence, he spoke the words that would define his reign. L'état c'est moi. I am the state. Louis declared that he would rule alone, an absolute monarch. There would be no more powerful advisers pulling strings behind the throne. Every decision, every law, every war, every tax, would come from him. The nobles who had once challenged his family, now stood before him, silent, obedient. The boy who had fled the mobs of Paris had become the master of France. But Louis knew that words were not enough. Power must be seen. It must be felt. It must surround you like the sun itself, blinding anyone who dared to look directly at it. Louis began crafting his kingdom in his image. His first target was the nobility, the very families who had humiliated him during the Fronde. Louis did not banish them. He did not execute them. He made them come to him. He summoned the great lords of France to his court, and he built the stage upon which they would all dance. A palace unlike any the world had ever seen. A place of beauty and excess, where power would be draped in gold and silk. Its name would echo through history, Versailles. Construction began in earnest in 1661. Thousands of workers dug into the marshland, drained the swamps, laid stone upon stone. Fortunes were spent, entire villages uprooted. Architects, gardeners, and artists were summoned from across Europe. The palace rose like a vision, a marvel of French art and ambition. Golden halls, mirrored galleries, endless gardens. A symbol of the king's glory, and his control. When it was complete, Louis moved his entire court to Versailles. The nobles, those who had once held armies, were reduced to courtiers. They danced at his balls, whispered in his halls, and begged for his favor. The days of rebellion were over. The nobility had not been destroyed, they had been domesticated. And Louis stood above them all, the Sun King. But power over the nobility was not enough. Louis wanted more. He wanted glory. He wanted France to dominate Europe. And so, he turned to war. The first target was his neighbor Spain. Spain was weakened, its king dying without a strong heir. Louis claimed parts of the Spanish Netherlands, arguing that they belonged to his wife Maria Theresa, daughter of the Spanish king. In 1667, French troops crossed the border. The War of Devolution had begun. French armies swept across Flanders, capturing towns with ease. Louis was victorious, but Europe was watching. The Dutch, the English, and the Holy Roman Empire feared French power. They forced Louis to halt his advance. He gained land, but not the dominance he craved. But Louis was patient. He strengthened his army, expanded his fortresses, and prepared for his next move. Because for Louis XIV, war was not just politics, it was personal. It was the ultimate display of his power, the extension of his will. If he was the state, then the state would march forward, under his son, conquering everything in its path. Louis XIV had tasted victory, but he wanted more. He set his sights on the Dutch Republic, an economic powerhouse, wealthy but vulnerable. Louis saw their wealth, their ports, their trade, everything he believed should belong to France. In 1672, he launched his greatest campaign, the Franco-Dutch War. The French army, modern, disciplined, and vast, marched into the Netherlands. Fortresses fell before them. Towns surrendered. But the Dutch would not break so easily. They opened their dikes, flooding their fields, turning the land into a sea, stopping the French advance. And Europe reacted. The Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Brandenburg Prussia joined the Dutch. Suddenly, Louis faced a coalition of powers, battling on all sides. The war dragged on for 6 years. Thousands of soldiers died in muddy fields and frozen forests. Louis gained territory, but the cost was high. France's enemies had united. The balance of power in Europe had shifted. And Louis was beginning to see that glory was not cheap. But victory, in his eyes, was still worth any price. Back in France, his court continued to glitter. Masked balls, lavish feasts, fountains spraying water into the sky. But beneath the gold, cracks were forming. The taxes to fund Louis's wars were crushing the peasants. Famine spread in the countryside, villages burned, fields abandoned. But Louis could not see it. From Versailles, everything seemed perfect. The nobles bowed, the palace shone, and his armies marched. He was the Sun King, the center of everything. But like the sun, his power burned hot, scorching those beneath him. And the longer he reigned, the more the shadows grew. Louis was not done. There would be more wars, more victories, more suffering. But for now, he stood at the height of his power. A king like no other. A god on earth. But gods often forget, they too can fall. By the final years of the 17th century, Louis XIV was no longer just a king. He was an empire unto himself. France was the most powerful state in Europe. Its armies were the largest, its culture the most admired, and its wealth seemed boundless, at least from the windows of Versailles. But Louis's hunger for glory had not faded. If anything, it had grown. Because beyond the borders of France, an opportunity was rising. An opportunity that could give Louis what he had always dreamed of, complete dominance over Europe. In 1700, King Charles II of Spain died. He was childless, weak, and his kingdom was crumbling from within. But his empire, Spain and its vast colonies, stretched across Europe and the Americas. Whoever claimed his throne would not just rule Spain. They would command a global empire.
And Louis saw his chance.
Charles II had named Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as his heir. If Philip took the Spanish throne, the crowns of France and Spain could be united. It would make the Bourbon dynasty the most powerful force the world had ever seen. But Europe would not allow it. The balance of power was at stake. If France and Spain became one, no kingdom would be safe. And so war came, one last great war, the War of the Spanish Succession. It began in 1701, a conflict that would stretch across Europe and beyond. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire formed the Grand Alliance, determined to stop Louis. Battles raged from the fields of Flanders to the hills of Italy. French armies fought bravely, but the strain was unbearable. The war dragged on for over a decade. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, on both sides. Entire villages were razed to the ground. Famine gripped France. The peasants starved while the nobles danced at Versailles. The illusion of glory was fading. Louis was no longer invincible. His generals suffered defeats. His enemies grew stronger. And the people who had once cheered him as the Sun King, now whispered in the shadows. Whispered of hunger. Whispered of suffering. Whispered of hate. For the first time, Louis felt the weight of his choices. Victory no longer seemed certain. But Louis was not a man to surrender. He clung to his vision, fighting not for land or power, but for his legacy. Because in his mind, he was not just a king, he was France. And France did not kneel. The war dragged on into the early 1710s. France was bleeding, its economy shattered, its people exhausted. But Louis pressed on, because for him, the crown was not just power, it was survival. If he lost everything he had built, Versailles, his armies, his legacy, could be swept away. The Allied forces, led by the Duke of Marlborough, won a series of crushing victories. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The Battle of Ramillies in 1706. The Battle of Oudenarde in 1708. Each defeat chipped away at the image of Louis as the untouchable Sun King. His enemies pushed deep into France. Paris itself seemed within reach. And the people suffered most.
Farms were burned. Crops failed.
Bread became a luxury. Hunger turned to despair. Mothers buried their children. Fathers watched their fields wither. And the name Louis XIV, once spoken with awe, was now cursed in the streets. But Louis did not break. At the age of 70, racked with illness, weakened by grief, he still ruled. Because for Louis, there was no alternative. To lose was to die. To surrender was to erase everything. And then finally, after over a decade of suffering, a fragile peace was found. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. Philip, Louis's grandson, was allowed to keep the Spanish throne. But France would never unite with Spain. Louis had won, partially. But the cost was devastating. His armies were drained. His treasury was empty. His people were broken. And his vision, his dream of France as the unrivaled power of Europe, had slipped through his fingers. Louis returned to Versailles, not as the conquering Sun King, but as an old man. He walked the same gilded halls, but they felt different now. The music was quieter. The laughter was thinner. The gold seemed less bright. Because Louis knew what few dared say aloud, his reign was ending. He had ruled for over 70 years, longer than any king in European history. But the weight of that crown had taken everything from him. His queen was dead. His son was dead. His grandsons were dead. The only heir left was his great-grandson, Louis XV, a fragile child. A boy who had not seen the wars, who had not felt the fire of rebellion, who did not know the cost of power. Louis stood at the height of his power, but he was alone. And deep down, he feared that everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, could one day be washed away. Because he had ruled as a god, untouchable, glorious, absolute. But the people he had overlooked, taxed and starved, they had not forgotten. And in their hearts, resentment was growing, like a seed in the dark. A seed that would bloom into revolution. But Louis would not live to see that. For now, he was still the Sun King. And the sun, though setting, still shone over Versailles. Louis XIV had won his final war, but the man who had stood at the height of European power now stood at the edge of death. His kingdom had endured his wars, his court had danced beneath his chandeliers, and his name had echoed through palaces and battlefields alike. But as the Sun King gazed out from the windows of Versailles in the final years of his life, he began to see what few monarchs ever dare to admit: even the brightest sun must set. He was no longer the invincible ruler of his youth. His once proud posture had stooped, his face etched with lines of suffering. Decades of stress, grief, and disease had weakened his body. But the real pain was deeper. Because power had cost him everything he loved. His beloved wife Maria Theresa had died in 1683, after years of enduring his affairs and his neglect. But it was the death of his children and grandchildren that broke him. In 1711, his eldest son, the Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox. Just a year later, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, along with his wife and their child, died in a wave of measles. One by one, his heirs perished, leaving only a frail, sickly great-grandson, Louis XV, as his successor. The line he had fought so hard to protect, the future of his dynasty, now rested on a fragile child. Louis XIV had built his kingdom to last forever, but as he stood in the Hall of Mirrors, surrounded by gold and glass, he could see the cracks. He had silenced the nobility, but he had not earned their loyalty. They had bent, but they had not forgotten. He had crushed the common people under taxes to fund his wars, but he had not won their love. They whispered curses in the fields he had never seen. He had crushed the common people under taxes to fund his wars, but he had not won their love. They whispered curses in the fields he had never seen. He had raised Versailles as a temple to his glory, but its foundations were not stone, they were bones. Bones of peasants who had died building it. Bones of soldiers who had fallen for his conquests. Bones of a family he had buried one by one. And now he felt it, the cold hand of mortality creeping over him. The man who had once believed himself the Sun King, immortal, divine, was now just a man. And he realized that power, for all its gold and splendor, could not defeat time. The crown was eternal. The king was not. On August 10, 1715, Louis XIV fell ill. At first, his court believed it was just another brief sickness. The king had endured so much before. But the infection in his leg, gangrene, spread rapidly. Doctors tried their crude remedies, bleeding, leeches, prayers, but nothing could stop the rot. The Sun King was dying. And as he lay in his bed, surrounded by his courtiers, his final thoughts were not of battles or palaces, they were of regret. He called for his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, a boy of just 5 years old. He held the child's hand, his voice weak but clear, and spoke the words that would echo through history. Do not follow my example. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. Avoid wars, they ruin the people. It was an admission that few rulers ever make, a recognition that his pursuit of glory had come at too great a cost. On September 1, 1715, after ruling for 72 years, Louis XIV, the Sun King, died. His death was met with mourning at court, but with relief in the streets. For the common people of France, his reign had been a time of suffering, war, famine, and taxes that crushed their spirits. As his body was carried to the royal basilica of Saint Denis, crowds gathered, not to honor him, but to jeer. The man who had believed himself a god was now nothing more than a corpse. But his legacy, his vision of France, would endure. Versailles would remain a symbol of power and beauty. French culture, art, and influence would shape Europe for generations. But the seeds of revolution had also been planted. Because while Louis had built an empire of gold, he had built it on suffering. And when his great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, stood on the same throne decades later, it would not be nobles who bent the knee, it would be revolutionaries holding ropes and guillotines. The palaces would burn. The monarchy would fall. The people, those he had overlooked, would rise. Louis XIV had built his kingdom to stand forever. But he had also laid the foundation for its destruction. Because absolute power, no matter how bright, always casts a shadow. And when the sun finally set on the House of Bourbon, the shadow would consume it. Louis XIV was gone. The Sun King, who had ruled for 72 years, had taken his final breath. The man who had once declared, "I am the state," was now nothing more than dust, laid to rest in the royal crypt at Saint Denis, among the kings of France. But his death was not the end. The kingdom he left behind, shaped by his vision, his wars, his splendor, would carry his mark for centuries. Some saw him as the greatest monarch in French history. Others saw him as the man who led his country toward ruin.
Both were right.
France, under Louis XIV, had reached the height of its power. His armies had marched across Europe. His navy had challenged the fleets of England. French culture became the envy of the world. Fashion, art, music, architecture, all carried the stamp of Versailles. The French language became the language of diplomacy, the language of kings and queens across Europe. And Versailles, the palace that Louis built, stood as the beating heart of this power. A place where every hallway whispered his name. Where every fountain danced in his honor. But beneath this grandeur, beneath the gold, the mirrors, the marble, was something far more fragile.
Debt. Suffering. Resentment.
Louis XIV had spent fortunes on his wars and his palaces, draining the treasury to project his image of power. He had raised taxes to fill the void, but those taxes did not touch the nobles or the court. It was the peasants, the farmers, the laborers, the families in the fields, who carried that burden. Year after year, they paid the price for Louis's glory. And though they bowed their heads in his time, their pain would not be forgotten. The Sun King had tamed the nobility. He had charmed the court. But he had ignored the people. And the people had long memories. In the decades that followed his death, his great-grandson, Louis XV, would inherit a kingdom that still shimmered on the surface but was crumbling underneath.
The taxes increased.
The bread grew scarce. The nobility danced while the commoners starved. And in the shadows, whispers turned to anger. Louis XIV's reign was not the end of French power. But it was the beginning of a countdown, one that would end in blood. Because the system he built, absolute power held by a king, supported by a court of nobles, resting on the backs of the poor, was not built to last forever. And when it fell, it would fall hard. But for now, in the years after his death, his legacy still burned bright. Europe had seen his power. The world had heard his name. And the Sun King still ruled, if not in body, then in memory. The legacy of Louis XIV stretched far beyond France. His reign changed Europe, forever. He had made France the dominant power on the continent. His wars had redrawn borders, weakened his rivals, and inspired fear across kingdoms. But more than that, Louis XIV had changed what it meant to be a king. He had elevated monarchy to something divine, something absolute. Kings across Europe looked to him as a model. Peter the Great in Russia studied Louis's court, his army, his navy, taking inspiration to modernize his own empire. Frederick the Great of Prussia saw Louis's discipline and strength as the standard for his own kingdom. Even in Britain, where the power of kings was increasingly limited, Louis XIV's grandeur forced English monarchs to justify their own strength. The idea of the Sun King, the ruler who was the state, became the image that monarchs chased for generations. But the lesson Louis left was not just for kings, it was for all who wield power. That absolute control comes with a cost. That glory built on suffering will not last. Because no matter how bright the sun burns, it always sets. In 1789, just 74 years after Louis XIV's death, the storm finally came.
The people rose up.
The nobility, once so proud of Versailles, now fled for their lives. And Louis XVI, the great-great-grandson of the Sun King, was dragged before the crowd. No palace could protect him now. No court rituals could shield him. He stood on a wooden platform, beneath a gray sky, staring at the guillotine.
The blade fell.
The monarchy Louis XIV had built, shattered. But the palace of Versailles still stood. And it stands to this day. A monument to the Sun King's vision, his glory, his excess, his power. A reminder of what he achieved, and what he destroyed. Because Louis XIV was more than a king. He was a symbol of what rulers can build when they hold nothing back. And of the price that is always paid by someone when they do.
Louis XIV was gone.
The Sun King's light had faded, but his shadow stretched across centuries. His reign had transformed France into the most powerful kingdom in Europe. His palace at Versailles stood as a symbol of wealth, elegance, and control. His wars had reshaped borders, and his vision of absolute monarchy had influenced rulers across the world. But his legacy was not only one of glory. It was also a legacy of suffering. The peasants who had labored under his taxes. The soldiers who had died in his wars. The families who had starved while he built fountains and mirrored halls. Louis XIV's dream had built an empire, but it had also planted the seeds of revolution. And when those seeds finally bloomed, they would consume the very monarchy he had worked so hard to strengthen. So we ask you, was Louis XIV a visionary? Did he secure France's place as the cultural and political leader of Europe? Or was he a tyrant, driven by ego, blind to the suffering of his people, and ultimately responsible for the fall of his dynasty? History remembers him as both. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below.
Because power, true power, always demands a price.
The only question is, who pays it? If you found the story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, fascinating, his reign is only one part of France's long journey through power and revolution. The century after his death would see his descendants struggle to hold onto the crown he had built. Until, finally, it all came crashing down in 1789, the French Revolution. The halls of Versailles would echo with the cries of the people. The king's crown would be replaced with a blade, the guillotine. But even then, from the ashes, a new ruler would rise. A man who would claim more power than even Louis XIV had dared to dream. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. If you think Louis XIV's reign was extraordinary, wait until you hear how Napoleon reshaped not just France, but the entire world. Click here to watch our full documentary on Napoleon, the emperor who conquered Europe. And don't forget, subscribe to our channel for more stories of power, ambition, and the people who shaped history. Because the past is not dead. It lives with us. And the kings of yesterday still shape the world we live in today. The year is 1697. A cold wind blows over the bustling docks of Amsterdam. The air is thick with the scent of salt and sawdust. The sound of hammers striking wood echoes across the shipyard. Men shout in Dutch as they build great vessels, ships that will soon command the seas. Among these workers is a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a gaze as sharp as a blade. His hands are rough from labor, his clothes simple, blending him into the crowd. But this is no ordinary man. This is Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, the Tsar of Russia. A ruler with absolute power over millions. A man who could, with a single word, order executions, build armies, or declare war. Yet here, in the heart of Western Europe, he is not a Tsar.
He is a student.
He is an apprentice. Because Peter knows a truth that few in Russia dare to accept, his empire is weak. While the rest of Europe builds fleets, forges cannons, and expands across oceans, Russia is trapped in the past. Its armies are poorly trained, its navy non-existent, its cities frozen in medieval traditions. And Peter will not accept this. He has seen what modern Europe can do, the power of ships, the precision of artillery, the wealth of trade. And he knows that if Russia does not change, it will fall. Peter is here for a purpose. He will study shipbuilding, learn the secrets of Western warfare, and bring that knowledge home. And when he returns to Russia, he will drag his empire into the future, through fire, through steel, and through blood. He will break the old ways, crush those who stand in his path, and force his nation into greatness. He will build a navy from nothing, carve a new city from the swamps, and defeat the mighty Swedish Empire, establishing Russia as a power that Europe will fear and respect.
But progress will come at a cost.
There will be rebellions, betrayals, and mass executions. Thousands will die to fulfill his vision. Because Peter the Great is not just a reformer, he is a force of nature. How did a boy Tsar, scarred by violence and palace intrigue, rise to become the man who reshaped Russia forever? How did his relentless drive for power and progress birth a modern empire? And at what human cost was this transformation achieved? This is the story of Peter the Great, the Tsar who built an empire. Russia, in the late 1600s, was not the vast superpower we know today. It was a land trapped in the past. While the rest of Europe surged forward into a new age of progress, science, and naval exploration, Russia remained isolated. It was a country of snow-covered forests, sprawling plains, and ancient traditions. A place where power rested in the hands of one man, the Tsar, an absolute ruler whose word was law. But this Tsar did not rule a modern nation. Russia's people were mostly peasants, serfs, tied to the land like slaves, their lives dictated by the will of noble landowners. Villages were primitive, cities were small and undeveloped, and roads turned to rivers of mud in the spring thaw. The Russian army was strong in numbers but weak in tactics, relying on brute force rather than strategy.
But the navy? There was no navy.
Russia had no access to warm seaports, and without ports, there was no fleet, no trade and no power on the seas. This was a kingdom isolated from Europe, cut off by vast forests, icy rivers, and the towering Ural Mountains. But perhaps the greatest wall between Russia and the West was its culture. The Russian Orthodox Church held immense power, and its leaders saw Western ideas as corrupt and dangerous. Men wore long beards as symbols of their faith. The nobility, known as the boyars, clung to old customs and resisted change at every turn. Russia was a land bound by tradition, ruled by fear, and untouched by the progress sweeping through Europe. It was a nation frozen in time.
But change was coming.
And it would come with fire and blood. On June 9, 1672, a child was born in Moscow, into the House of Romanov, the ruling dynasty of Russia. His name was Pyotr Alexeyevich, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov. He was the 14th child of Tsar Alexei, a ruler who had brought relative stability to Russia, but whose reign was still haunted by the violence and chaos of the past. Peter's mother was Natalia Narishkina, a woman of humble roots, which made her position at court a source of tension. Because in the palace, alliances were as deadly as swords. When Tsar Alexei died in 1676, the struggle for power tore the Romanov family apart. The throne passed to Peter's older half-brother, Feofor III. But Feofor was sickly, and when he died in 1682, the question of succession plunged the empire into violence. On one side was Peter, supported by his mother Natalia and her Narishkin family. On the other side was Peter's older half-sister Sophia, and the Miloslavsky family, who supported Peter's other half-brother, Ivan V. weak, nearly blind, and mentally unfit to rule. The conflict erupted into bloodshed. The Streltsy, the elite palace guards, rose up in revolt. They stormed the Kremlin, dragging noblemen from their homes, cutting them down with axes and spears. Peter, just 10 years old, hid in terror as he watched from a palace window. He saw men thrown from towers, their bodies broken on the cobblestones below. He saw his family butchered before his eyes. That day would scar him forever. Peter and Ivan V were declared joint tsars, with Sophia acting as regent, the true power behind the throne. But Peter was just a child. He had the title of tsar, but none of the power. And he never forgot the sight of blood on the palace walls. While Sophia ruled Moscow, Peter was sent away. He grew up in the countryside, away from the poisonous politics of the Kremlin. But this exile would shape him in ways no one expected. Because Peter was not like the other tsars. While other noble children learned courtly manners, Peter was building forts, cannons and wooden warships. He formed his own army, boys from the village, drilling them like soldiers. He became obsessed with the military, but even more with the sea. In the German quarter of Moscow, he met European artisans, engineers and sailors, foreigners who brought ideas from the West. They told him of great fleets, modern cities, and nations that ruled the waves. Peter listened. He absorbed everything. He learned shipbuilding, how to fire artillery, and how to construct fortresses. He worked with his hands, something no czar had ever done. And deep inside him, a vision was taking shape. Russia would no longer be a prisoner of the past. Russia would become a modern power. But to build a new Russia, Peter would first need to seize the throne. And that would require crushing those who stood in his way. Peter the Great had seized the crown. The Kremlin was his. His sister Sophia was cast aside, locked away in a convent, her power stripped from her like a discarded robe. His frail half-brother, Ivan V, still wore the title of Khazar, but he was a figurehead, an empty shell. The true ruler of Russia was now Peter. But the crown alone was not what Peter wanted. He wanted something far greater. He wanted to transform Russia into a power that could stand alongside the mighty kingdoms of Europe. Yet, the Russia he inherited was ancient, stubborn, and fractured. It was a land where tradition ruled with an iron grip, where the Orthodox Church held sway over every aspect of life, and where the boyars, the noble families, clung to their old ways like armor against the future. Peter knew that if he was to build his vision of a new Russia, he would need to break the chains of the past. And breaking chains always draws blood. The boyars were the first obstacle. These nobles saw Peter's ideas as a threat to everything they valued, tradition, power, and their way of life. Peter looked to the west, to England, to Holland, to Prussia, and he saw a future where armies marched with discipline, where fleets of warships ruled the seas, and where cities rose like monuments to human progress. But when he looked at Russia, he saw bearded nobles draped in long, heavy robes, symbols of their orthodox faith and resistance to Western influence. Peter decided that the transformation of Russia would begin with them. One day, at a public gathering, Peter appeared with a pair of giant shears in his hand. He summoned the boyars forward, one by one. Before they could protest, he grabbed their beards, their sacred beards, seen as a symbol of piety, and began cutting them off. The crowd watched in horror as chunks of hair fell to the ground. For these men, it was not just hair, it was their dignity, their tradition, their faith. Peter laughed as he cut, declaring, "We must look to the future, not the past." Those who resisted faced fines, or worse. The boyars were humiliated. But Peter's message was clear: Russia would change, and no one was exempt. But beards were only the beginning. Peter abolished traditional Russian robes, forcing nobles to wear European coats and breeches. Banquets were no longer filled with silent rituals. Now men and women were ordered to mingle, to dance, to drink wine and speak freely, like the courts of France and England. For many in the old guard, this was not progress, it was blasphemy. But Peter did not care. Because while the nobles fretted over their clothes, Peter was building something far more dangerous, a modern army. Russia's military had always relied on sheer numbers, waves of poorly trained peasants hurling themselves at enemies.
Peter wanted discipline. He wanted firepower.
He wanted artillery that could shatter walls and fleets that could control the seas. He imported European officers, Dutch, German, Scottish, men who knew modern warfare. Russian recruits were drilled like never before, taught to march in formation, to reload muskets with precision, to fight as a machine, not a mob. Peter's army was taking shape, but he knew that land power alone was not enough. Russia was a prisoner, locked away from the sea. Without a navy, without ports, Russia would always be at the mercy of its enemies. Peter looked to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, to the places where Russia's future lay. And he knew that war was coming. But before Peter could launch his vision outward, Russia would bleed from within. The Streltsy, the palace guards, the same men who had murdered Peter's family when he was just a boy, rose up again. They were loyal to the old ways, to Sophia, to the past. Rumors spread that they planned to restore her to power. When Peter heard the whispers, he acted without mercy. The Streltsy were rounded up, tortured, beaten, broken. Peter did not delegate the punishment.
He took part in it himself.
Wielding an axe with his own hands, he beheaded the rebels. Some were hung from the city walls, others were impaled on spikes, their bodies left to rot in the streets as a message to all of Russia. The message was clear: Peter's Russia would rise, or it would drown in blood. But Peter was not done. Because Russia's transformation required more than soldiers and discipline. It required knowledge, the kind only the West could provide. And Peter was willing to leave his throne to get it. He would travel to the heart of Europe, not as a czar, but as a common man. And what he learned would change Russia forever. In 1697, Peter the Great did something no Russian czar had ever dared to do. He left his empire. He traveled west, not as a monarch, but in disguise, as a common laborer, using the name Pyotr Mikhailov. He walked the streets of Amsterdam, of London, of Vienna, not as a ruler, but as a student. In Dutch shipyards, Peter worked with his own hands, learning how to build ships, hammering planks alongside common carpenters. He studied the British Royal Navy, observed artillery drills in Austria, and visited factories that produced cannons capable of reducing fortresses to rubble. Everywhere he went, he asked questions, endlessly, obsessively, about navigation, fortifications, trade, and governance. But back in Russia, the old ways refused to die. While Peter was abroad, the Streltsy rose up once more. They marched on Moscow, calling for Sophia's return.
Peter rushed home, and he brought vengeance with him.
Thousands of rebels were executed. Men were hung in the streets, their corpses swaying in the wind. Peter even hung some outside Sophia's convent window, forcing her to stare at the rotting faces of her supporters. This was no longer just a power struggle. This was a revolution by fire. Peter demanded loyalty, not to the past, but to the future he was forging with his own hands. The army was rebuilt, trained with Western discipline. The navy was born. Shipyards sprang up along Russia's rivers and coasts. Peter declared that Russia would no longer be a landlocked kingdom. It would sail the seas, trade with the West, and defend itself with fleets as powerful as any in Europe. But Peter's vision would require one final step. War. Because Russia needed ports, ice-free ports. And those ports belonged to the Swedes and the Ottomans. Peter was ready to fight. But Europe had not yet seen what Peter the Great was truly capable of. And soon, the world would learn that when Peter declared war, it was not simply a conflict. It was a transformation. Peter the Great had returned to Russia, but he had not come home as the same man who left. He had seen what the West had to offer: fleets of powerful warships, disciplined armies, and cities that hummed with trade and wealth. He had seen what Russia could become. And now, he was ready to make that vision a reality. But for all his reforms, all his beards cut and robes banned, there was one thing Peter knew above all else. True power came from the sea. Russia was vast. Its land stretched farther than any European kingdom, but it was caged by ice and borders. Without ports, Russia was like a bear chained to a forest floor, while the other empires of Europe sailed freely across oceans. To the south, the Ottoman Empire controlled the warm waters of the Black Sea. To the west, the powerful kingdom of Sweden held the Baltic Sea, guarding the routes that led to Western Europe. Peter needed a window to the west. He needed a port. And he knew there was only one way to get it: war. Peter's eyes turned to the Swedish Empire, led by a young and fearless king, Charles XII. Sweden was not the largest kingdom, but its military was feared across Europe. Swedish armies had humbled Poland, Denmark, and even the Holy Roman Empire. But Peter believed Russia's future lay in the Baltic. And he was willing to bleed his nation dry to seize it. In 1700, Peter formed an alliance with Denmark and Poland, launching the Great Northern War. Their target was the same: Sweden. Peter's army, though reformed, was still young and untested. His soldiers marched toward the Swedish fortress of Narva, confident in their numbers. But Charles XII was not like other kings. He was only 18, but he was a warrior, a man born for battle. As Peter's army surrounded Narva, Charles led a daring counterattack with just 12,000 men against Peter's 40,000. The Russian army was shattered. Thousands died. Peter's soldiers fled through the snow, their bodies freezing as they ran. It was a disaster, Russia's humiliation laid bare before Europe. But Peter did not break. Defeat was nothing new to him. He had seen worse. He had seen his family murdered as a child. He had seen betrayal, rebellion, and blood fill the streets of Moscow. Defeat was only the beginning. Peter retreated, but he rebuilt. His soldiers trained harder, his factories produced more weapons, and his shipyards worked day and night to create a navy that could challenge the Swedes. For 8 long years, Peter fought. The Great Northern War became a test of endurance, a brutal struggle across frozen fields and blood-soaked forests. Swedish victories were swift, but Peter's strength was patience. He could afford to lose battles because he knew that, in the end, Sweden would tire. And in 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Peter's patience was rewarded. Charles XII marched into Russia, leading his army deep into Peter's territory. He believed he could end the war with one decisive blow. But Peter had learned from his failures. He lured the Swedish army into the heart of Russia, stretching their supply lines thin. Then, outside the town of Poltava, Peter struck. The battle was fierce. Cannons roared, musket balls tore through the air, and soldiers fought hand to hand in the dirt. But this time, it was Peter's army that stood firm. This time, the Swedes broke. Charles fled into exile. His army was destroyed. Russia had won. Peter's victory at Poltava changed everything. The myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered. Russia was no longer a backward kingdom, it was now a force to be reckoned with.
Peter had his prize.
The Baltic Sea was within his grasp. And with it, he would build his empire's future.
But Peter was not done. A port was not enough.
He wanted a city, one that would stand as a symbol of Russia's rebirth. A city that would rise from nothing, carved from the very earth by the hands of his people. And its name would be St. Petersburg. Peter stood on the shores of the Neva River, gazing out toward the Baltic Sea. The land before him was a swamp, drenched in water, plagued by mosquitoes, and cursed with freezing winds. But in Peter's eyes, it was a blank canvas. Here he would build his capital, a new city, a new Russia. St. Petersburg would be Peter's window to the west. It would be his answer to the cities of Europe, a place of grandeur, trade, and power. But the land did not yield easily. Tens of thousands of peasants were dragged to the site, laborers, soldiers, and prisoners.
They had no choice.
They cut timber, dug trenches, and hauled stone through the freezing mud. Their tools were crude, their boots thin, and their backs bent under the weight of Peter's ambition.
Thousands died.
Disease swept through the camp, malaria, dysentery, starvation. Some collapsed in the mud and were buried where they fell. Others froze in the brutal winters, their bodies stiff like statues.
But Peter did not stop.
When his advisors warned him of the death toll, he answered coldly, "Let the dead bury the dead."
The work must go on.
For 5 long years, the city slowly rose from the swamp. Stone buildings replaced wooden shacks. Wide avenues were laid down, modeled after the great cities of Europe. Canals were carved into the land, giving the city the appearance of Venice. Peter invited European architects to design palaces, government buildings, and churches. He wanted St. Petersburg to be a city unlike any in Russia, a city that looked westward, not east. And when it was done, he made it his capital. The court was moved from Moscow to this new city. Those who resisted, nobles, church leaders, old families, had no choice. Peter had built his vision, and they would live in it. St. Petersburg was more than a city. It was a message to the world. Russia was no longer an isolated kingdom in the east. It was a European power, modern, armed, and ready to shape history. But the cost of Peter's dream was staggering. Tens of thousands had died. Families were shattered. And Peter himself had changed. Years of war, rebellion, and struggle had hardened him. The young boy who had once watched his family die had become a man who ruled with an iron fist. He had executed his enemies, crushed his rivals, and even ordered the torture and death of his own son, Alexei, when he suspected him of treason. Power had made Peter great. But it had also made him cruel. In 1725, Peter the Great died, his body worn down by illness, his mind still restless with ambition. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, a Russia that would shape the world for centuries. But his legacy was not just one of power. It was a legacy of change, of a nation dragged into the future, whether it wanted to go or not. Some remember him as a visionary, a modernizer, the father of the Russian Empire. Others remember him as a tyrant, a man who built his dream upon the bones of his own people. But there is one truth that no one can deny. Peter the Great changed Russia forever. Peter the Great had built his city. St. Petersburg stood as a symbol of power and progress, a European city on Russian soil, a gateway to the west. His navy now patrolled the Baltic, his armies held their ground across Eastern Europe, and his enemies, from the Ottomans to the Swedes, had learned to fear his name. But behind the grand facades of palaces and government halls, cracks were forming, within his empire, within his family, and within Peter himself. Because power, absolute power, always comes with a price. Peter had spent his life fighting against the past, dragging Russia into the future by sheer force of will. But the old Russia was not so easily erased. Even as Peter's reforms reshaped the military, the government, and the culture, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The boyars, the noble families, still whispered against him, their beardless faces hiding their hatred. The church, stripped of much of its influence, saw him as a tyrant who had sold Russia's soul to the West. The peasants, millions of them, lived as they always had, bound to the land, burdened by taxes, and crushed under the weight of their labor. For them, Peter's modern Russia was a distant dream, a world of palaces and fleets they would never touch. But the greatest threat to Peter's legacy would not come from his enemies. It would come from his own blood. Peter's son, Tsarevich Alexei, was everything Peter was not. Where Peter was bold and aggressive, Alexei was quiet and cautious. Where Peter loved war and progress, Alexei clung to tradition, the old Russia of faith, ceremony, and stability. And Peter saw this as betrayal. Alexei was the heir to the throne, the future Tsar. But to Peter, he was a danger, a threat to everything he had built. Peter demanded strength, obedience, vision. But Alexei wanted peace. He wanted to undo his father's reforms, to return Russia to what it had been before Peter's iron hand took hold. Father and son became enemies. Their relationship turned cold, distant, poisoned by suspicion and disappointment. Alexei fled Russia, seeking refuge in Vienna under the protection of the Habsburg Empire. For Peter, this was not just defiance, it was treason. A Tsarevich, the heir to the Russian throne, turning to a foreign power for protection. It was the ultimate insult, the ultimate threat. Peter would not allow it. He sent his agents across Europe, hunting his own son. Alexei was found, captured, and brought back to Russia in chains. But Peter was not content with exile or imprisonment. He wanted to break his son, to make him confess, to make him submit. In 1718, Alexei was dragged before his father, bound, beaten, and afraid. Peter ordered his son to be tortured. The Tsarevich, once destined to rule, was whipped, beaten with rods, and interrogated for days. Each strike of the cane was a message from Peter. There is no room for weakness in Russia. Alexei's body gave out before his will did. He died from his injuries, killed by his father's command. Peter had won. He had destroyed the last threat to his vision. But in doing so, he had destroyed a part of himself. Because the man who had built Russia's future had killed his own future. Peter was left with a throne, but no heir he trusted. A kingdom, but no son to continue his legacy. The Tsar who had defied armies, storms, and rebellions had lost his greatest battle, the battle for his own family. And deep within him, a question began to form. Had the price of his dream been too high? Peter the Great had secured his empire, but his heart was scarred. The death of his son haunted him. Those closest to him whispered that Peter had aged in ways that no war or rebellion had ever managed. His eyes seemed more tired, his once endless energy dampened by guilt. But Peter was not a man to dwell in sorrow for long. He threw himself back into his work, building, reforming, expanding, trying to outrun the shadow of what he had done. He tightened his grip on Russia even further. The military grew stronger. The navy expanded. St. Petersburg became a symbol of power across Europe. But Peter had changed. He ruled with more suspicion, more paranoia. He saw threats everywhere. Courtiers were arrested on whispers of betrayal. Officials who resisted his reforms vanished, executed, imprisoned, or sent to die in Siberia. The boyars bowed lower. The church kept its head down. But fear was everywhere. Even those who admired Peter for his vision knew the Tsar's wrath was never far away. By 1724, Peter's health began to fail. Years of war, work, and stress had taken their toll. But Peter was not a man to rest. Even as his body weakened, his spirit burned as fiercely as ever. In November 1724, he received word that a group of sailors had become stranded during a storm on the Gulf of Finland. Despite his failing health, Peter personally led a rescue mission into the freezing waters. He saved the men, but he paid the price. The cold waters worsened his illness. Fever gripped him. Pain racked his body. For weeks he fought, just as he had fought all his life. But this was a battle he could not win. On February 8, 1725, Peter the Great, Tsar of all Russia, died. He was 52 years old. The man who had dragged Russia out of the shadows, who had crushed rebellions, built cities and defeated empires, was gone. His last words, scribbled on paper in his weak hand, were never finished. They simply read, "Give all to..." But no one knows what he intended to say. Some believe he wanted to name his wife, Catherine, as his successor. Others believe he meant to give his legacy to Russia itself. But the truth died with him. What Peter left behind was not just a crown, it was a new Russia. A Russia with ports on the Baltic, a navy that sailed the seas, and an army that Europe feared. A Russia with St. Petersburg, his city, his dream, standing as a monument to his vision. But he also left behind scars. Tens of thousands had died to build his empire. Families had been torn apart. His own son had been killed by his hand. To some, Peter the Great was a hero, the father of modern Russia. To others, he was a tyrant, a ruler who forced progress at the cost of human life. But one thing is certain: Peter changed Russia forever. The nation he built would go on to become one of the most powerful empires in history. But the question remains, was it worth the price? Peter the Great was dead. The man who had ruled with an iron hand, who had dragged Russia from medieval isolation into modern Europe, was gone. But his shadow lingered over the empire he had built. His death left a void, one that could not easily be filled. Peter had reigned as both a visionary and a tyrant, his will shaping every corner of Russian life. Without him, there was no clear successor, no heir with his strength or vision. His son Alexei was dead, killed by Peter's own hand. The Romanov family, though powerful, was divided, suspicious of each other, uncertain of the future. In the days following his death, the Russian court was gripped by tension and fear. Who would lead? Would the boyars try to seize back their power? Would Peter's reforms be undone? Or would Russia fall into another period of chaos? But Peter had left one last surprise. Before his death, he had elevated his second wife, Catherine, to the status of empress. Catherine had been born a peasant, a servant in Peter's household. But through her charm, intelligence, and loyalty, she had won his heart and his trust. Now, with Peter gone, Catherine was crowned as Russia's first empress. Her reign would be brief, just 2 years, but it would set a precedent. For the first time in Russian history, a woman held the throne. But Catherine ruled not as a rival to Peter's vision, but as its protector. She defended his reforms, continued his policies, and kept Russia on the path Peter had carved with blood and iron. Yet, even as Catherine held the empire together, the cracks were still there, hidden beneath the surface. The boyars still hated the Western ways forced upon them. The church still whispered that Peter had corrupted Russia's soul. And the peasants, millions of them, still labored in poverty and servitude, their suffering unchanged by Peter's dreams. Peter had built a powerful Russia, but he had not built a united one. The cost of his vision, the death, the suffering, the fear, would not be forgotten. And in the decades to come, Russia would struggle to decide what it truly was, a European empire, or a kingdom bound to its ancient traditions. Peter had opened a door to the West, but he had also left Russia standing between two worlds, never fully European, never fully its old self. That tension would define Russia's future, shaping its politics, its rulers, and its people, for centuries to come. Because Peter had not simply changed Russia's borders, he had changed its identity. And identity is not so easily rewritten. But Peter's influence would stretch even further, beyond his death, beyond Russia's borders, into the very heart of European power. Because the Romanovs, his dynasty, would not just survive. They would rise. And the empire Peter built would become one of the most feared and powerful forces in the world. The Romanov dynasty, strengthened by Peter's reforms and military victories, would rule Russia for nearly 200 more years. His successors, empresses like Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, and later tsars like Alexander and Nicholas, would build upon his foundation. Under Catherine the Great, Russia would expand further, conquering Crimea, pushing into Central Asia, and asserting its power across Eastern Europe. The navy Peter built would become a symbol of Russian dominance in the Baltic and the Black Sea. The army he modernized would march across the battlefields of Europe, fighting Napoleon, crushing uprisings, and shaping the balance of power. But Peter's vision, the fusion of Western progress and Russian tradition, would always remain fragile. Every ruler after Peter struggled with the same question: how much of the West should Russia embrace? Some, like Catherine the Great, pushed forward, embracing European culture, philosophy, and science. Others, like Nicholas I, turned back, clamping down on dissent, strengthening the grip of the church and the boyars. That tension, between reform and control, between progress and tradition, became the heartbeat of Russian history. Peter's city, St. Petersburg, became the symbol of that dual identity. It was a European capital built on Russian soil, a place of art, culture, and diplomacy, but also a place of suffering, built on the backs of thousands who died in its construction. Even today, St. Petersburg stands as a reminder of Peter's dream, the city where Russia reaches toward the west, but still carries the weight of its past. But Peter's greatest legacy, the one that would echo long after his death, was not just his army, his navy, or his city. It was the idea that Russia could be more, that it was not bound to isolation, that it could shape the world, not just endure it. Peter planted that seed, through his victories, his reforms, and his brutal will. And that belief, that Russia could be great, would inspire leaders long after him. It would fuel Catherine's conquests. It would drive Alexander to defeat Napoleon. It would give Stalin the vision to forge the Soviet Union into a superpower. But it would also carry a curse, the curse of power built on fear. Because Peter's way, his absolute control, his crushing of dissent, became the model for many Russian rulers after him. Power in Russia became something to be seized, held tightly, and defended at all costs. And the people, so often left behind in Peter's march toward progress, would continue to pay the price. From the Romanovs to the Soviets, from Stalin to Putin, that legacy of power, progress, and control has never truly left Russia. Peter the Great built an empire. But he also built a struggle that lives on in every chapter of Russian history. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy of all. Because Peter did not just change Russia, he made it question what it truly is. And that question remains unanswered, even today. Peter the Great was a ruler like no other. A man who towered over his people, not just in height, but in vision. A man who tore Russia from the grip of its past, dragging it, kicking and screaming, into a new age. He built cities where there were only swamps. He forged a navy from nothing. He defeated enemies that had once seemed invincible. And he turned Russia into a European power, an empire that would shape global history for centuries. But he did so at a price few would be willing to pay. Thousands died to build his dream, laborers, soldiers, and even his own son. The streets of St. Petersburg were paved with sacrifice. The palaces of the Romanovs stood on the bones of the forgotten. To some, Peter was a visionary, the father of modern Russia. To others, he was a tyrant, a man who ruled through fear and blood. But what do you think? Was Peter the Great a hero, or a despot? Did his vision justify the suffering he caused? Or could Russia have found a different path, one without the pain and cruelty he inflicted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because history is not just about kings and empires, it's about the choices we make, and the price we are willing to pay for progress. And the story of Peter the Great is a story we are still writing today. Because every nation, every leader, still faces the same question: how far will we go to achieve power? And how much are we willing to sacrifice to shape the future? Peter the Great's legacy did not end with his death. His city, St. Petersburg, stands to this day, a monument to his vision. His empire, the Russian Empire, would grow to become one of the largest in history. His dynasty, the Romanovs, would rule for nearly 2 more centuries, shaping the fate of Russia and the world. But the questions Peter left behind remain. Even today, Russia stands between East and West, torn between its past and its future. The same struggle that Peter began still echoes in the halls of the Kremlin. Leaders still wrestle with the balance of power and progress. The people still bear the weight of those choices. And the world still watches Russia, wondering which path it will choose. The story of Peter the Great is not just Russia's story, it is a story of power, ambition, and sacrifice. A reminder that the pursuit of greatness often comes with a terrible cost. But it is also a story of possibility. Of what can be built, even in the harshest lands, even against the greatest odds, when vision and will collide. And so, as we look at the world today, at rising powers, shifting alliances, and the ever-present struggle for dominance, Peter's story asks us to consider: what kind of future are we building? And what price are we willing to pay to create it? If you found this journey through history compelling, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that shape the world. And if you want to see another tale of power, ambition, and sacrifice, watch our documentary on Catherine the Great, the woman who would take Peter's empire to new heights. Because history is not over. It lives with us. And the choices we make today will become the stories they tell tomorrow. For 16 years, Rome lived in fear. Their greatest armies had been slaughtered, their generals humiliated, their mighty republic brought to its knees by one man, Hannibal Barca. He was the nightmare that haunted Rome's every waking moment, a shadow they couldn't outrun.
No one could stop him.
No one even dared to try.
Until now.
Scipio Africanus was not the strongest, not the most experienced, and certainly not the most obvious choice to lead Rome's final stand. But he saw something no one else did. Hannibal wasn't invincible. His weakness wasn't on the battlefield, it was in his mind. And Scipio would exploit it like no one before him. This isn't just a story of war. This is the story of the man who beat the unbeatable. The only general who outplayed Hannibal at his own game. Because in history, only a few men have ever dared to challenge legends and won. The Roman Republic was bleeding. For over a decade, Hannibal had roamed freely across Italy, destroying entire legions, humiliating Rome's greatest commanders, and turning its allies against it. The Battle of Cannae had been more than just a defeat, it had been a massacre. 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead in a single day. The Republic had never suffered such devastation. The Senate was in disarray, the people lived in fear, and Rome's legendary discipline had cracked under the weight of despair. Hannibal should have marched on Rome itself. He could have ended the war, seized the city, and erased the Republic from history.
But he didn't.
He hesitated, choosing instead to wait, hoping Rome would surrender out of fear. It was his one mistake, the only mistake he ever made. And in that moment of hesitation, a new force began to rise. A young Roman, barely more than a boy, watched his city burn, watched his heroes fall, and swore an oath. Rome would not die. It would rise again. And he would be the one to make it happen. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was not like the others. While Rome's generals threw themselves at Hannibal in desperation, repeating the same mistakes, Scipio did something different.
He studied him. He learned from him. He obsessed over him. He saw the patterns in Hannibal's tactics, the way he controlled the battlefield, the way he forced his enemies to destroy themselves. And then he did the unthinkable. He proposed that Rome stop fighting like Rome, and start fighting like Hannibal. The Senate called him reckless. His rivals called him arrogant. But the truth was, Scipio Africanus was something Rome had never seen before, a visionary. And so, while Rome continued to fight defensive, losing battle after battle, Scipio did something bold. He took the war to Carthage itself. He didn't wait for Hannibal, he forced him to come home. He burned Carthaginian cities, cut off their supply lines, and left them no choice. Hannibal had always chosen the battlefield. He had always dictated the terms of war. But now, for the first time, he was forced to react. He was forced to defend. And he was forced to face an enemy who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The world had never seen a battle like this before. The master of war, undefeated, unstoppable, standing face to face with the only man who had dared to challenge him. The Battle of Zama was coming. And only one legend would survive. Hannibal was returning home. After 16 years of waging war on Roman soil, after crushing every general Rome had thrown at him, after proving time and time again that no one could match his mind, he was being called back to defend Carthage. He hadn't lost a single battle on Roman soil. Not one. And yet, here he was, forced to leave behind the war he had dedicated his life to winning. But this time, he wasn't fighting desperate Roman commanders clinging to their last hope. He wasn't facing men who feared him. He wasn't fighting Rome's past. He was facing Rome's future. He was facing Scipio Africanus. Scipio had spent years studying Hannibal, but Hannibal had never faced a man like Scipio. This was not a Roman who played by the old rules, not a general bound by the rigid formations of the Republic. Scipio had rebuilt his army in Hannibal's image. Flexible, mobile, unpredictable. And, just like Hannibal had once done to Rome, Scipio planned to turn Carthage's own strategies against them. He had learned the lessons of Cannae, the massacre that had nearly ended Rome. He had studied how Hannibal had lured the Romans into overextending themselves, trapping them in a perfect encirclement. And now, Scipio was about to do something Hannibal had never expected. He was going to trap the trapper. But first, he had to make a bold move. One that would either prove his brilliance, or end in complete disaster.
Instead of waiting for Hannibal to strike, instead of playing defensive like every Roman before him, Scipio marched straight for Carthage itself. He burned cities along the way, forcing Carthage to recall their greatest general, pulling Hannibal out of Italy before he could finish what he had started. Carthage, which had always fought its wars in distant lands, suddenly found itself defending its own home. And now, for the first time in his career, Hannibal wasn't dictating the war, he was reacting to it. He had to fight on Scipio's terms. And Scipio had set the perfect stage. The final confrontation would take place at Zama, a quiet plain outside Carthage. Hannibal still had his war elephants, his veterans, his brilliant tactics. He believed he could do to Scipio what he had done to Rome for years. But there was one thing he didn't account for. Scipio had already anticipated his every move. This wasn't just another battle. This was a war of minds, a chess match between two of the greatest strategists in history. Hannibal had never been beaten. But Scipio wasn't here to fight. He was here to win. The morning sun rose over the plains of Zama, casting long shadows over the battlefield where history would be written. Two men stood on opposite sides. One, the greatest general Rome had ever produced, and the other, a living legend who had humbled the Republic time and time again. Hannibal had never lost a battle like this. Scipio had never fought an enemy like this. And in just a few hours, one of them would be finished forever. Hannibal's army was a mix of hardened veterans and last-minute recruits. His war elephants, the terrifying beasts that had crushed Roman legions before, stood at the front, their tusks sharpened, their riders waiting for the signal. He had arranged his troops in layers, the mercenaries in the front, the Carthaginian infantry in the middle, and his most elite veterans at the back. If anyone could turn the tide of war, it was them, the same men who had stood beside him at Cannae, the same warriors who had once slaughtered Rome's finest. Scipio, on the other hand, had built his army differently. He knew Hannibal's strategies, he had studied them for years. He knew the elephants would charge first. He knew Hannibal would try to recreate the same double envelopment that had destroyed Rome's armies before. But this time, Rome would not fall into his trap. Instead of forming the usual Roman tight-packed lines, Scipio did something no one expected. He left gaps in his ranks, open corridors between his soldiers. It seemed like a mistake, a fatal flaw in his formation. But it wasn't. It was a trap. As the Carthaginian horns blared, the elephants charged forward, their massive feet shaking the earth. The Roman soldiers held their ground. The beasts, expected to smash through their lines, instead found themselves running straight through the gaps. Scipio had tricked them. Rather than allowing the elephants to crush his infantry, he let them pass through harmlessly. Once inside, they were vulnerable, easy targets for the Roman cavalry and skirmishers who quickly took them down. Hannibal watched in horror. His first attack had failed. But he was far from finished. He ordered his mercenaries, Gauls, Iberians and Numidians, to engage the Romans. The battlefield exploded into chaos, the sound of clashing steel and desperate cries filling the air. The fight was brutal, vicious. But Scipio had one more advantage that Hannibal wasn't expecting: loyalty. The mercenaries fighting for Carthage were not fighting for a homeland. They were fighting for money, and money meant nothing if you were dead. As the battle dragged on, some of Hannibal's men began to break. First a few, then more. Rome was holding its ground. Hannibal's once invincible army was starting to crack. And Scipio knew it. He had waited for this moment. He was about to deliver the final blow. Hannibal saw what was happening. He had one last chance. His veterans, his undefeated warriors, the men who had stood with him at Cannae, were still waiting at the back. He had to break Rome's lines. He gave the order. The elite Carthaginian infantry advanced, shields locked, moving forward with terrifying precision. These were not mercenaries. These were Hannibal's finest. If anyone could turn the tide, it was them. For a moment, it seemed like the battle was shifting. The Romans were pushed back. The sheer force of Hannibal's elite troops threatened to split Scipio's center wide open. The Carthaginians could feel it. Victory was still possible. But then, the trap snapped shut. Scipio had saved his cavalry for this exact moment. His Numidian horsemen, led by the brilliant Massinissa, had chased away Hannibal's cavalry earlier in the battle. Now they returned, not from the front,
but from behind. Hannibal's army was surrounded. It was canny in reverse. The same strategy that Hannibal had once used to annihilate an entire Roman army was now being used against him. Scipio's forces closed in from all sides, trapping Hannibal's troops with no escape. Panic set in. The Carthaginians fought desperately, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. Hannibal knew it was over. For the first time in his life, he had been outplayed. His men were slaughtered. His veterans, the warriors who had stood with him through 16 years of war, were dying around him. And there was nothing he could do. When the dust settled, Carthage's army was destroyed. Hannibal had lost his first and final battle. Rome had won. Scipio Africanus had done the impossible. He had defeated the man no one could defeat. The war was over. But Scipio wasn't finished. What happened next would decide the fate of Carthage itself. Would Rome erase its greatest rival from history? Or would Scipio show mercy? The war had been won. But the final act of the Punic Wars was just beginning. Hannibal was gone. His army lay in ruins, his undefeated veterans lay dead on the battlefield, and the mighty war machine of Carthage had been shattered. For the first time in history, Rome had done what it had failed to do for over a decade. It had broken the unbreakable. But the war wasn't over yet. Scipio Africanus now stood at the gates of Carthage. The city was vulnerable, its walls weak, its leaders divided. The Roman Senate wanted total destruction, to do what Hannibal had once dreamed of doing to Rome. To burn Carthage to the ground, to erase it from the maps, to make sure it never rose again. But Scipio hesitated. He could have marched his legions in and ended Carthage once and for all. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the weight of history. Perhaps it was because he had studied Hannibal so deeply that he respected him in ways no one else did. Or perhaps he understood something Rome never had. True victory isn't just about winning a war. It's about shaping the future. Instead of annihilating Carthage, Scipio offered terms. The Senate was furious. They wanted blood. But Scipio was the one who had won the war, and for now they listened. The treaty was brutal. Carthage would surrender all of its warships, pay a massive tribute, and lose its ability to wage war without Roman permission. Carthage, once the greatest power in the Mediterranean, was now a vassal state of Rome. The war was over. The Republic had won. Or so they thought. Because Hannibal Barca was still alive. And he was not finished yet. Hannibal had escaped the battlefield at Zama, but he had not escaped Rome's vengeance. He returned to Carthage, where the people still saw him as their last hope. He reformed the government, restored the economy, and in just a few years, Carthage began to rise again. But Rome was watching. And they would never let him rebuild the power he once had. The Senate issued a demand: Hannibal must be handed over to Rome. His own city, his own people, turned against him. He was forced to flee, running from city to city, from one kingdom to another. No matter where he went, Rome hunted him. They feared him, not because he had an army, but because of what he represented. Hannibal Barca was more than a general. He was the only man who had ever truly made Rome afraid. And so, Rome did not rest until he was dead. In the end, they found him in the court of the Seleucid king in the east, living as a fugitive, still plotting against Rome, still dreaming of revenge. When Roman agents finally closed in, Hannibal knew there was only one way this story could end. He refused to give Rome the satisfaction of executing him. Instead, he took poison. His last words? "Let us relieve Rome of her anxiety by the death of an old man." And just like that, the greatest enemy Rome had ever faced was gone. But if Rome thought that would be the end of Hannibal Barca, they were wrong. Because history would never forget him. Rome had won. The Second Punic War was over. Hannibal was gone, Carthage was crippled, and the Republic had secured its dominance over the Mediterranean. The city erupted in celebration. And at the heart of it all was Scipio Africanus. He was the hero of Rome, the man who had saved the Republic from destruction, the general who had outwitted the greatest strategist of all time. When he returned to Rome, he was given a triumph, the highest honor a Roman could receive. He marched through the streets in a golden chariot, his soldiers cheering, the people throwing flowers in his path. He had achieved what no one else could. He had done the impossible.
But Scipio knew something no one else did. Rome wasn't just celebrating its victory over Carthage. It was celebrating its future as an empire. The war had changed everything. Rome was no longer just one power among many. It was the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean. And Scipio was the man who had made it possible. But power comes with a price. Because Rome had never been kind to its heroes. And Scipio was about to learn that victory on the battlefield did not guarantee survival in the halls of politics. The same Senate that had once begged Scipio to save Rome now feared him.
He was too powerful, too respected, too loved by the people.
And in Rome, that was dangerous. The Republic did not trust men who rose too high. They did not like leaders who were larger than Rome itself. His enemies in the Senate, men who had never fought a day in their lives, began whispering against him. They accused him of corruption, of misusing war funds, of acting like a king instead of a Roman. The same men who had once doubted him, who had opposed his bold strategies, were now working to erase him from power. And the worst betrayal came from someone close to him. Marcus Porcius Cato, a senator who had despised Scipio for years, led the charge against him. He spread rumors that Scipio had taken bribes from the defeated Carthaginians, that he had grown too arrogant, that he was a threat to the Republic itself. Scipio, the man who had saved Rome, was now being treated as a traitor. It wasn't enough that he had won Rome's greatest war. He had to be destroyed politically. Tired of the endless accusations, Scipio left Rome in disgust. He withdrew to his family estate in Liternum, far from the city he had once fought to protect. He never returned to Rome. He refused to give the Senate the satisfaction of putting him on trial. And as he faded from public life, he left behind one final message, a bitter reminder of how Rome repaid its heroes. On his tomb, he had these words inscribed: "Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones." Scipio Africanus, the savior of Rome, died in exile, abandoned by the Republic he had given everything to protect. But history did not forget him. The tactics Scipio used at Zama became legendary. Military leaders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon studied his strategies, analyzing how he had defeated the undefeated. His ability to adapt, to learn from his enemy, to change the way Rome fought wars shaped the future of the Republic and later, the Empire. Even Hannibal himself, before his death, admitted one thing. Scipio was the greatest general Rome had ever produced. Rome may have turned its back on him, but the world never did. And today, over 2,000 years later, his name still stands among the greatest military minds in history. Because Scipio Africanus was more than just a soldier. He was the man who changed the fate of Rome forever. The ground is soaked with blood. The bodies of soldiers, men, women, and children lie scattered across the fields. Smoke rises from the charred remains of villages, and the air is thick with the cries of the dying. Vultures circle overhead, feasting on the flesh of the fallen. The river runs red, carrying the last breaths of thousands toward the sea. Amidst this devastation, a man stands, his armor stained, his sword heavy with death. His eyes, once filled with the fire of conquest, are now clouded with something unexpected, remorse. The weight of the slaughter presses down on his chest heavier than any crown. This is Ashoka, the emperor of the Maurya Empire, the ruler of the largest kingdom in ancient India. He has won the war. But as he surveys the destruction he has caused, he realizes, this is no victory. This is hell. A conqueror who had once believed that power came from the sword now questions everything. What is the price of his ambition? What has his empire truly gained? And what has his soul lost? Ashoka would never be the same. This battle, this massacre, would mark the end of the warrior king and the birth of something far greater. Ashoka would lay down his sword and choose a different path. A path of peace. A path that would not only transform his empire but echo across Asia for thousands of years. But how did he come to this moment? What drove this ruthless prince to power? What pushed him to conquer? And what broke him on the fields of Kalinga? This is the story of Ashoka the Great, the king who carved his empire with blood but ruled with compassion. A man who discovered that true power is not found in war, but in peace. Long before Ashoka stood over the fields of Kalinga, drenched in blood and regret, he was a boy, born into power but raised in its shadows. His world was not one of peace. It was a world built on strength, ambition, and fear. This was the Maurya Empire, the largest and most powerful empire India had ever known. Its borders stretched from the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas to the lush forests of the south, from the plains of the Ganges to the deserts of the west. An empire built not by treaties, but by the sword. Its founder, Chandragupta Maurya, had seized power with the help of the brilliant strategist Chanakya. Together, they had overthrown the Nanda dynasty and defeated the remnants of Alexander the Great's armies in the northwest. Chandragupta was a warrior king, a man who believed that mercy was weakness and power was survival. When he stepped down, his son Bindusara took the throne. Bindusara expanded the empire even further, crushing rebellions, subjugating kingdoms, and earning the title Amitragata, the slayer of enemies. This was the world Ashoka was born into, a world where kings ruled by force and empires survived only through conquest. Ashoka was born in 304 BCE, in the royal palace of Pataliputra, the beating heart of the Maurya Empire. But he was not the favored son. His mother, Subhadranji, was not a queen from a powerful family. She was a lesser wife, a woman of lower status. And in the royal court, status meant everything. While his elder brothers were groomed as heirs, Ashoka was pushed aside, seen as little more than a spare. But what he lacked in privilege, he made up for in determination. From a young age, Ashoka displayed a sharp mind and an even sharper sword. He excelled in battle, riding horses, mastering archery, and leading troops with a ferocity that shocked even the seasoned generals. But his ambition made enemies. His brothers feared him, whispering that he was dangerous, that he would one day challenge their claim to the throne. And they were right. Because even as a boy, Ashoka knew, if he wanted power, he would have to take it. And in the Maurya court, power was never given. It was seized. Years passed. Ashoka grew into a man, a warrior feared across the empire. But fear is a dangerous thing. By the time his father, Bindusara, fell ill, the palace had become a den of vipers. The princes, Ashoka's brothers, saw their chance. Plots were hatched. Alliances were forged in shadows. Poison cups and assassins lurked behind every curtain. And Ashoka, despite his strength, was not safe. His eldest brother, Susama, the heir to the throne, saw Ashoka as his greatest threat. He persuaded Bindusara to send Ashoka far away, to the distant province of Ujjain, to govern a rebellious territory. But it was not an honor, it was exile. Susama hoped that his brother would be killed by the rebels, or forgotten altogether. But Ashoka did not fall. He crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, earning the loyalty of his soldiers and the respect of the people. And in Ujjain, he found something unexpected, love. He met Devi, a woman unlike any he had known. She was not of royal blood, but her wisdom and kindness touched something deep within him. She became his wife, and in her arms, Ashoka glimpsed a life beyond war, a life of peace. But peace was not his destiny. Back in Pataliputra, Bindusara was dying. The throne was within reach, and blood would decide who sat upon it. Ashoka was summoned back to the capital. But when he arrived, he did not come as an exile. He came as a conqueror. The city trembled at his return. His soldiers filled the streets. And when Bindusara died, the struggle for succession erupted into violence. Ashoka fought not just with swords, but with fear. His rivals were executed. His brothers were butchered, one by one. Susama, the heir, was thrown into a pit filled with live coals, burned alive. The palace walls were stained with royal blood. And when the screams faded, Ashoka stood victorious. He was crowned the emperor of the Maurya Empire, the Chakravartin, the universal ruler. But the crown he wore was not made of gold. It was forged from betrayal and violence. Ashoka had claimed the throne, but at what cost? He was now the most powerful man in India. But in the shadows of the palace, the ghosts of his brothers whispered. And deep inside Ashoka knew, his rule had been born in blood. And blood would follow him. The throne was his. The empire was his. The blood of his rivals had been washed from the palace floors, but Ashoka knew it was never truly gone. He could still see it in his mind, his brothers' eyes wide with fear, their screams as they were cut down or burned alive. The echoes of his rise to power followed him into his reign.
But if he had any guilt, he buried it beneath his crown. Ashoka had claimed the title of Chakravartin, the universal ruler. He now ruled over an empire that stretched across nearly all of the Indian subcontinent, from the Himalayas in the north to the southern kingdoms, from the Bay of Bengal in the east to the borders of Persia in the west. But power, he had learned, was like a river, it never stood still. It had to keep flowing, expanding, or it would wither and dry up. Ashoka ruled from Pataliputra, the heart of the Maurya Empire, a city of palaces, temples, and fortified walls. But he was no king content to sit on his throne. He toured his lands, inspecting his provinces, meeting his governors, and ensuring the loyalty of his vassals. The message was clear: Ashoka was not just a figurehead. He was present. He was watching. His rule was marked by efficiency, but also by fear. Those who challenged his authority were swiftly punished. Dissidents disappeared. Rebellious governors were executed. There were rumors of a torture chamber within the palace, known as Ashoka's Hell, where enemies of the state were subjected to unimaginable suffering. Ashoka's justice was swift and merciless. But beneath his iron grip, the empire prospered. Trade routes flourished, connecting India with Persia, Greece, and China. Farmers harvested their crops in peace, knowing that the Mauryan army would crush any invaders. Gold flowed into the treasury. Markets bustled with spices, silk, and precious stones. Ashoka was becoming more than just a king. He was becoming a legend. But power breeds hunger. And Ashoka's hunger was not yet satisfied. There was one region that stood apart, one kingdom that defied the Maurya Empire. Kalinga. A small but fiercely independent state along the eastern coast of India. The people of Kalinga were proud, known for their warriors and their spirit. They had resisted the Mauryas for generations, standing as a symbol of defiance in an empire that bent all others to its will. And Ashoka could not allow that defiance to continue. For him, Kalinga was more than a kingdom, it was a challenge. A blemish on his empire, a reminder that his power was not yet absolute. He ordered his armies to prepare. Thousands of soldiers gathered, elephants adorned in war paint, archers stringing their bows, swords sharpened to glisten under the sun. The call to war thundered across the empire. Ashoka would crush Kalinga. And he would show the world that no one defied the Chakravartin and lived. The year was 261 BCE. The Mauryan army, one of the largest the world had ever seen, marched toward Kalinga. Tens of thousands of soldiers advanced under the imperial banner. Foot soldiers in endless rows, cavalry thundering beside them, and war elephants moving like living fortresses. The people of Kalinga knew what was coming. But they did not flee. They did not surrender. They stood. Men, women, even children took up arms, determined to defend their freedom, their homeland. The battle that followed would be remembered not for its glory, but for its horror. When the armies clashed, the earth shook. Spears shattered, swords sliced flesh, and elephants trampled warriors beneath their feet. But the people of Kalinga did not break. They fought like lions, refusing to bow. It only made Ashoka more determined. The Mauryan forces pushed harder, burning villages, cutting down all who resisted. It was not just a battle. It was a massacre. When the dust settled, Kalinga was no more. Over 100,000 people lay dead. Another 150,000 were taken as prisoners. Thousands more died later from disease, starvation, and displacement. The rivers ran red with blood. Bodies littered the fields, rotting under the sun. Victory was Ashoka's. His empire was now whole. But as he stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the dead, something broke inside him. He saw not enemies, but fathers clutching their sons, mothers shielding their children, families torn apart. The smell of death choked him. The screams of the dying rang in his ears. And for the first time in his life, Ashoka, the slayer of brothers, the conqueror of Kalinga, felt not triumph. He felt shame. He had won everything he had ever wanted. But he had lost something far greater, his soul. In that moment, Ashoka, the warrior king, died. And from his ashes, a new Ashoka would rise. A man who would turn away from war. A man who would seek a different kind of power, one built not on fear but on peace. But could a man who had ruled with blood truly become a king of compassion? Or would his past always haunt him? The path to redemption would not be easy. But Ashoka was ready to walk it. The fields of Kalinga had fallen silent. The fires had burned out, and the bodies had been gathered into heaps. The vultures had had their feast. But for Ashoka, the battle had not ended. It had only just begun. The war within his heart was fiercer than any he had fought with swords. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, the mothers clutching lifeless children, the fathers gasping their final breaths, the warriors who had stood tall until the end, now reduced to corpses. Victory had always been his goal. But now, standing at the peak of his power, he realized he had paid a price far greater than he had ever imagined. Ashoka, the conqueror, had become Ashoka, the destroyer. He returned to Pataliputra, but he was not the same man. His palace, once a place of pride, now felt cold. The wealth and grandeur meant nothing. The whispers of his officials, the bows of his nobles, none of it mattered. His heart was heavy. His spirit broken. And then, he heard a voice. Not from his court. Not from his generals. But from a place he had never looked before, the voice of a monk. A Buddhist monk, robed in simplicity, carrying nothing but the teachings of the Buddha. The monk spoke not of conquest, but of compassion. Not of power, but of peace. He spoke of Dhamma, the way of righteousness, the path to end suffering, the path to inner peace. For the first time in his life, Ashoka listened. Truly listened. And something stirred within him, a spark, small but bright. Ashoka sought out more monks. He sat with them beneath trees, in simple halls, far from the gold and jewels of his palace. He learned of the Four Noble Truths, the reality of suffering, its cause, its end, and the path to liberation. He learned of the Eightfold Path, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and the journey toward wisdom and compassion. Each word felt like a hammer striking the chains around his heart. The burden of Kalinga, the burden of all his wars, did not vanish. But he began to understand it. He began to carry it differently. Ashoka, the emperor who had ruled with blood, decided to walk a new path. He would rule not with fear, but with Dhamma. But could an empire built on violence truly survive on peace? The world had never seen such a thing. And neither had his enemies. Ashoka's transformation was not a whisper in the dark. It was a proclamation to the world. He declared his new vision, Dhammavijaya, victory through righteousness. He would no longer seek to expand his empire through war. Instead, he would conquer hearts. He would build roads, not armies. Hospitals, not fortresses. Wells for travelers. Shade trees along highways. Rest houses for the sick and the poor. He sent doctors to heal his people. He passed laws against cruelty to animals. He banned the unnecessary slaughter of livestock. And across his vast empire, he had his message carved into stone, pillars and rock edicts that stood as tall as his ambitions. The words etched into these stones were not about his victories in battle. They were about compassion. About tolerance. About respect for all religions. He addressed his subjects directly, as if speaking to their hearts. All men are my children, he wrote. And I desire for my children that they may enjoy every kind of prosperity and happiness in this world and the next. It was unlike anything the world had seen. A king, the most powerful man in India, not boasting of his conquests, but asking his people to be kind to each other. But not everyone celebrated his change. In the palaces and military camps, there were whispers. Some generals questioned his weakness. Some nobles mocked his compassion as softness. His enemies beyond the borders watched closely, wondering if the lion had truly sheathed his claws, or if this was simply a trick. But Ashoka was not blind. He knew the world was still dangerous. His armies remained strong. His fortresses still stood. But now, they were not his first weapon. They were his last. Ashoka understood that true strength was not the ability to destroy, but the power to choose not to. The power to build instead. Years passed, and his vision began to take root. The people prospered. The land flourished. But Ashoka knew, his past would always be part of him. The fields of Kalinga could not be erased. He carried them with him, not as a curse, but as a lesson. And he vowed, never again would his empire wage war. Never again would his people suffer as Kalinga had. He had conquered with violence. Now, he would rule with peace. Ashoka the Great, the warrior king, had become Ashoka the Compassionate. And in doing so, he changed not only his empire, but the soul of India. Years had passed since Ashoka renounced war and embraced the path of Dhamma. His empire stretched across vast lands,
his name spoken with respect not only in India but across neighboring kingdoms. But the world is not easily changed. Ashoka's transformation had brought prosperity, but it had also brought questions. There were those within his court who respected his vision, who saw his shift from violence to peace as wisdom. But there were others, powerful nobles and generals, who whispered in the corners of the palace. They asked, what happens when a king lays down his sword? What happens when the lion lowers his claws? Would his enemies not see this as weakness? Would the edges of the Maurya Empire, those restless kingdoms beyond its borders, not test him? Some feared that Ashoka's commitment to non-violence had made the empire vulnerable. Rebellions flared in distant provinces. Border tribes grew bolder, testing the strength of the once feared Mauryan legions. Governors reported unrest in the south. The Kalinga region, though pacified, still simmered with resentment. The scars of war had not fully healed in the hearts of those who survived. Ashoka listened. He did not ignore these threats. But he remained resolute. He would not return to the sword. He chose instead to strengthen his empire through diplomacy. He sent envoys to neighboring lands, forming alliances based not on fear, but on trust. He reached out to kingdoms across the Indian subcontinent, to the Tamil lands of the south, to the western cities along the Arabian Sea, and even beyond, to Sri Lanka, Nepal, and lands now known as Afghanistan. But it was his efforts beyond India that marked the true test of his vision. Ashoka's emissaries crossed the Himalayas, carrying his message of peace into Tibet and China. They traveled west, reaching Persia, even touching the distant lands of Greece. And southward across the sea, Ashoka sent his own son, Mahinda, and daughter, Sanghamitta, to Sri Lanka. They carried not armies, but the teachings of the Buddha. And on that island, a new chapter began. Buddhism took root, shaping the culture and spirit of Sri Lanka for thousands of years. Ashoka was not simply preserving his empire. He was planting seeds, seeds of peace, of knowledge, of faith, that would outlast him. But in the shadows of the palace, those who believed in strength watched with doubt. The empire was vast, but could it survive on kindness alone? Ashoka's transformation had changed him. But had it weakened his empire? Some feared that when Ashoka was gone, everything he built would crumble. And others, perhaps, hoped it would. Time is the enemy that no king can conquer. As Ashoka aged, the strength that had carried him through battles and guided him on his path to Dhamma began to fade. His once powerful frame grew weaker. His steps slowed. His voice softened. But his mind remained sharp. His heart remained steady. He ruled with wisdom, but he knew his time was ending. The question that haunted all great rulers began to circle him. Who would take his place? Ashoka had many wives and many sons. But power, he knew, was a dangerous thing. Ambition had burned in his heart when he was young. He had seized the throne through blood, killed his brothers to wear the crown. And now he saw that same ambition in the eyes of his own sons. Even as Ashoka sought peace, his sons fought among themselves, each wanting to claim the empire when their father was gone. Plots unfolded within the palace. Assassinations were whispered. Poison cups were passed in the dark. The same cycle that had brought Ashoka to power was beginning again. And he could not stop it. He tried to name a successor, Kunala, his son with Queen Padmavati, a man known for his gentleness and kindness. But rivals in the court conspired against him. Kunala was blinded, robbed of his claim to the throne. Ashoka's heart broke. He had hoped to leave behind a kingdom of peace. Instead, he saw the future, one filled with the same bloodshed that had marked his past. In his final years, Ashoka withdrew from the palace. He spent more time with the monks, more time meditating beneath trees, more time reflecting on the life he had lived. He knew his empire was the largest India had ever seen. He knew his name would be remembered. But he also knew the truth. A king's power is temporary. Empires rise. Empires fall. But ideas, they endure. Ashoka's empire would not last forever. But his message, his Dhamma, would. The pillars he had raised, the words he had carved into stone, would stand long after the palace walls crumbled. A warrior who had chosen compassion. A king who had learned that true power is not in taking lives, but in saving them. Ashoka the Great was no longer the ruler of an empire. He had become something far greater. He had become a guide for generations yet to come. Ashoka the Great, the emperor who had ruled over the largest empire in Indian history, was dead. The man who had once stood on the fields of Kalinga, sword dripping with blood, and later carved messages of peace into stone pillars across his realm, had taken his final breath. But his death was not met with unity. There was no grand procession celebrating a legacy of harmony. Instead, there was silence, unease. And in the shadows of Pataliputra, the whispers of ambition stirred once more. Ashoka's dream of a kingdom built on Dhamma, on righteousness, peace and compassion, was fragile. The vision had lived in his heart, but his sons and grandsons did not carry it the same way. His death left behind a vacuum, and in an empire built on the bones of war, power never sat still for long. The struggle for succession erupted. Ashoka had ruled for decades, but he had not built a clear path for who would follow him. The sons he had left behind were divided, vying for power, seeking to carve the empire into pieces for themselves. Kunala, the son who had been blinded, could not rule. Other princes, Dashratha, Samprati and Jalaka, each held parts of the empire but lacked their father's strength. The unity that Ashoka had fought so hard to create, first through blood, then through peace, began to unravel. Provinces declared independence. Governors sought power for themselves. The southern territories drifted away. The western edges grew restless. And in the once mighty capital of Pataliputra, the Maurya dynasty that had stood for nearly 150 years began to crumble. Within just 50 years of Ashoka's death, the empire he had built, the empire he had dreamed would stand as a beacon of Dhamma, was gone. A kingdom that had stretched from the Himalayas to the southern seas had fractured into smaller states. The Maurya dynasty, which had once challenged the power of Alexander's successors, was no more. The sword had built it. And in the end, the sword had undone it. Ashoka had turned away from war, but the world around him had not. And without his strength, his vision could not hold it together. But if Ashoka's empire had fallen, his true legacy had not. Because Ashoka's greatest conquest was not land. It was the human heart. And the seeds he had planted, the teachings of Dhamma, were beginning to bloom. Ashoka's empire vanished. His palaces were overtaken by the jungle. His line faded into history. But his message endured. The pillars he had raised, those great stone edicts, carved with words of peace and compassion, stood tall, even as kings came and went. The Dhamma, the teachings of nonviolence, tolerance and righteousness, spread far beyond the borders of his former empire. Ashoka's son, Mahinda, and his daughter, Sanghamitta, had carried Buddhism to Sri Lanka, where it flourished, shaping the island's culture for thousands of years. From Sri Lanka, the message traveled further. Monks carried Ashoka's vision to Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. The teachings crossed mountains into Tibet. They moved into China, shaping dynasties and philosophies. Buddhism, once a small movement within India, became a world religion, touching millions across Asia. And wherever it went, Ashoka's name traveled with it. He became a symbol, not of conquest, but of redemption. A king who had turned from war. A ruler who had embraced peace. Centuries later, his story was nearly forgotten in India itself. But his pillars, the stone edicts he had left behind, remained. Hidden in forests. Buried beneath earth. In the 19th century, British archaeologists uncovered them. And there, carved in stone, the voice of Ashoka spoke again, after more than 2,000 years. His message was still clear. Let all beings live in peace. Let no one harm another. Let compassion guide our hearts. Ashoka's lion capital, the symbol atop his pillars, became the national emblem of modern India. The wheel of Dhamma, the Ashoka chakra, was placed at the center of India's flag. A reminder to every Indian every day of the man who had once ruled with power, but chose peace. Ashoka the Great, the warrior king who became the emperor of peace. His empire had fallen. But his true conquest, the hearts and minds of generations, would never fade. Ashoka's story is not simply the tale of a king. It is the story of transformation, of a man who stood at the peak of power and chose to step back. A man who had everything, but saw that victory built on death was no victory at all. How many rulers have ever made that choice? How many conquerors have turned from their armies and asked, What is the true meaning of power? Ashoka could have continued his wars. He could have ruled with an iron fist until his final breath. But he chose a different path. And that choice echoes through history, not just in India, but across the world. Because Ashoka's legacy is not stone pillars or royal decrees. It is a question, a challenge, to all those who hold power. Can strength be found in peace? Can an empire endure on compassion? The year is 1588. The English Channel is filled with the towering sails of the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval fleet the world has ever seen. King Philip II of Spain has sent an unstoppable force to crush England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, and bring the Protestant nation under Catholic rule. England stands on the brink of destruction. Its navy is smaller, outgunned, and outnumbered. The Spanish have more men, more ships, and more firepower. Victory seems inevitable. But then, from the shadows of history, emerges one man. A sailor, a privateer, a pirate, and a warrior. He is bold, ruthless, and fearless. He has spent years raiding Spanish ships, stealing their treasures, and humiliating their empire. His name is Sir Francis Drake. To the English, he is a hero, the man who will turn the tide of war. To the Spanish, he is El Drac, the dragon, the most feared pirate to ever sail the seas. And now, the fate of England rests in his hands. How did a humble sailor rise to become the most feared sea captain in the world? How did a man once branded a pirate become the savior of England? And how did he defeat an empire that seemed invincible? This is the story of Sir Francis Drake, the pirate who saved England. But to understand how he reached this moment, we must go back, to his beginnings, to a time when Spain ruled the seas and England was just another nation trying to survive. Before Sir Francis Drake became a legend, before he was feared by the Spanish and celebrated by the English, he was just a boy growing up in a world dominated by one of the greatest empires in history, the Spanish Empire. Drake was born in 1540, in the small town of Tavistock, Devon, on the southwest coast of England. His family was not wealthy, nor were they powerful. His father, a Protestant preacher, had to flee their home when Catholic uprisings threatened his life. The Drakes moved to Kent, where they lived near the sea, and it was here that young Francis fell in love with the ocean. In the mid-1500s, England was not the great naval power it would later become. Spain ruled the seas. The Spanish controlled vast territories in the New World. Gold and silver flowed into their ports from the mines of South America. Their ships, known as galleons, carried treasures worth fortunes. No other nation dared challenge them. England, by contrast, was weak on the global stage. Queen Elizabeth I had inherited a country that was financially unstable, struggling to compete with Spain's power. The English navy was small, and England had no colonies in the Americas. For Drake, this imbalance was clear. Spain had everything. England had nothing. At a young age, Drake became a sailor, working under his relatives, the Hawkins family, one of England's most prominent trading families. But their business was not ordinary trade. They were involved in privateering and the transatlantic slave trade. It was with the Hawkins fleet that Drake first tasted battle against the Spanish. In 1568, while on a voyage in the Caribbean, the English fleet was ambushed by the Spanish at San Juan de Ulua. The Spanish massacred many of the English sailors. Drake barely escaped with his life. That day, he learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. The Spanish would never show mercy. And so he vowed, neither would he. He returned to England humiliated but determined. He had seen the Spanish ships loaded with gold and silver, and he had seen how they dominated the seas. Drake did not want revenge. He wanted to change history. From this moment on, Drake dedicated himself to one mission, to strike back at Spain, to weaken their empire, and to take what they had stolen from the world. And soon, Queen Elizabeth herself would take notice of his talents. By the early 1570s, Francis Drake was no longer just another sailor. He had transformed into one of the most daring and ambitious privateers in England. He had learned from his near-death experience at San Juan de Ulua, and now, he was ready for revenge. But revenge alone was not enough. Drake wanted more. He wanted gold, power, and the respect of Queen Elizabeth I. And he knew exactly where to get it, from the Spanish Empire. Spain's control over the Americas and the Caribbean had made them the richest nation in the world. Their treasure fleets carried tons of gold and silver from the mines of South America back to Spain. But these fleets had to cross the Atlantic, making them vulnerable to attack. This was where Drake saw his opportunity. He began planning a series of daring raids, striking at the very heart of Spanish wealth, their treasure ships, their ports, and their supply lines. His first major raid came in 1572. Drake and a small crew of 73 men sailed to the Caribbean and targeted the Spanish city of Nombre de Dios in present-day Panama. This city was one of Spain's main treasure hubs, where silver from Peru was stored before being shipped to Europe. It was a fortified city, heavily guarded, but Drake was fearless. He and his men landed in the dead of night, sneaking past the Spanish guards. Then, in a lightning-fast assault, they stormed the city, cutting down Spanish soldiers and reaching the royal treasury. They were so close to seizing millions in silver when Drake was badly wounded in the attack. Bleeding, weak and unable to fight, he had no choice but to retreat. His men carried him back to the ship, and they were forced to leave behind the greatest treasure they had ever seen. But Drake was not finished. Even after his near-fatal injury, he refused to leave the Caribbean empty-handed. He gathered local allies, including escaped African slaves known as the Cimarrons, who also hated the Spanish. Together, they planned an even greater heist. Instead of attacking another city, Drake set his sights on a Spanish treasure convoy, a mule train carrying gold and silver through the jungle. In a masterfully executed ambush, Drake and his men struck the convoy, seizing an enormous amount of treasure. This time, there was no last-minute injury, no failed attempt. Drake had won. After months of raiding, he returned to England a rich man and a legend. But Drake's victories in the Caribbean were just the beginning. He had embarrassed Spain, stolen their gold, and humiliated their soldiers. And now, Queen Elizabeth herself was ready to reward him, with a mission that would make him immortal. By 1577, Drake had proven himself as one of the greatest privateers in England. He had fought the Spanish, raided their ports, and made himself a fortune. But now, he was about to embark on his most daring mission yet, a journey that would take him around the world. For years, Spain had claimed the Pacific Ocean as their own, believing that no other European power could challenge them there. They used it as a safe trade route, shipping massive amounts of gold and silver up the coast of South America before sending it across to Spain. But Queen Elizabeth wanted to change that. She secretly commissioned Francis Drake to do the impossible, sail into the Pacific and raid Spain's most valuable cities and ships. This was not just piracy. This was a declaration of war. Drake set sail with 5 ships and 164 men, heading west across the Atlantic. But before he could even reach the Pacific, disaster struck. The voyage was plagued by terrible storms, infighting and treacherous conditions. One ship was lost in a storm, another turned back, and by the time Drake finally reached the southern tip of South America, only one ship remained, his flagship, the Golden Hind. It was here, at the most dangerous waters in the world, the Strait of Magellan, that Drake faced his greatest test yet. The passage was narrow, filled with violent waves, deadly rocks and unpredictable winds. No English sailor had ever navigated it successfully. Many had tried. Most had died. Drake pushed forward. For weeks, his crew battled against the elements, desperately trying to reach the Pacific. When they finally emerged on the other side, they were exhausted, but victorious. They had done what no Englishman had ever done before. But there was no time to celebrate. Because now, they were in enemy waters, and it was time to attack. Drake had made it to the Pacific, but now came the true test, striking at the heart of Spain's power. The raids that followed would shake the Spanish Empire to its core. Francis Drake had done the impossible. He had navigated the Strait of Magellan, reaching the Pacific Ocean, Spain's most prized and protected waters. No Englishman had ever sailed these seas before. To Spain, the Pacific was theirs. It was a safe trade route, where their treasure-laden ships moved without fear of attack. Until now. Drake and his crew, now sailing on the Golden Hind, had one mission, to raid Spain's richest ports and ships, to strike at the heart of their empire, and to take their gold. The first target? The Spanish treasure fleet. Spain's ships carried millions in gold and silver from their colonies, but they had no reason to expect an English ship in the Pacific. Drake moved like a ghost, striking before his enemies even knew he was there. Off the coast of Chile, He captured his first Spanish vessel, a small but wealthy ship carrying gold and valuable supplies. Then, in Peru, he raided Callao, one of the richest ports in the region. But his greatest prize was still ahead, a single Spanish galleon known as the Cacafuego. This ship was one of the most valuable in the world, carrying an enormous load of treasure. Drake pursued it for days, racing across the Pacific, closing in on his target. Then, in a swift and brutal ambush, the Golden Hind struck. Drake's men fired grappling hooks, boarding the Spanish ship before the crew even had a chance to fight back. In minutes, the battle was over.
And the treasure? Unimaginable.
With one attack, Drake had captured a fortune beyond belief. But now, there was a problem. How would he get back to England without being caught by the Spanish?
The chase was on.
Francis Drake and his crew stood on the deck of the Golden Hind, surrounded by tons of gold, silver, and jewels. They had just stolen one of the richest treasures Spain had ever transported. But now, they faced an even greater challenge, getting home alive. Drake knew that the entire Spanish fleet would soon be hunting him. If he tried to sail back through the Strait of Magellan, he would be caught and executed. So he made a bold decision, one that would make history. Instead of turning back, Drake kept sailing west. He continued across the Pacific, landing in the Philippines, where his crew restocked supplies and repaired their ship. Then, he sailed to Indonesia, trading with local rulers and gathering more wealth. Finally, in 1579, he set course for home, not through the Atlantic, but around the entire world. It was a treacherous journey, filled with storms, disease, and constant fear of capture. But after nearly 3 years at sea, the Golden Hind finally arrived back in England in 1580. Drake had circumnavigated the globe. He had stolen millions from Spain, humiliated their empire, and made himself one of the richest men in England. But his greatest test was still ahead. The Spanish Armada was coming. Francis Drake had done the unthinkable. He had circumnavigated the globe, raided Spanish ports in the Pacific, and stolen millions in gold and silver from Spain's greatest treasure fleets. When he returned to England in 1580, he was a legend. But his success came at a price. Spain was furious. King Philip II, ruler of the Spanish Empire, demanded his execution. To Spain, Drake was not a hero, he was a criminal, a pirate, and a traitor to international law. But in England, he was welcomed as a national hero. The people of England celebrated his return, and Queen Elizabeth I herself came aboard the Golden Hind to personally greet him. Then, in an act that sent shockwaves across Europe, Elizabeth knighted Drake on the deck of his ship. For Spain, this was an insult beyond measure. Drake's private raids had always been deniable. The English crown had never officially admitted to backing him.
But now?
Elizabeth had publicly honored him. This was not just a gesture. It was a declaration of war. And Philip II would not let it go unanswered. Philip II was already planning his revenge. He would build the greatest naval fleet in history, an armada powerful enough to crush England forever. And when the time came, Drake would have to fight, not as a pirate, but as England's greatest admiral. The Spanish Empire had been the most powerful force in the world for nearly a century. They had conquered entire continents, built vast cities, and controlled an oceanic trade network that spanned the globe. But Francis Drake had humiliated them. He had raided their richest cities, burned their ships, and stolen their gold. And now, Spain wanted revenge. King Philip II began planning his greatest attack yet, a fleet so powerful, so unstoppable, that it would crush England once and for all. This fleet would be called the Spanish Armada. Philip II began constructing over 130 warships, filling them with 25,000 soldiers and sailors. The Armada would sail to England, land thousands of troops, and overthrow Queen Elizabeth. But Drake was not going to wait for them to attack. In 1587, a year before the Armada was ready, Drake launched a preemptive strike, an attack that would change history. Francis Drake had spent years preparing for this moment. He had raided the Spanish, stolen their gold, humiliated their fleets, and now, Spain was coming for revenge. King Philip II of Spain had assembled the most powerful naval force in history, the Spanish Armada. This fleet was not just for battle, it was for conquest. Philip II's goal was not just to defeat England, but to invade it, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. This would not be just another war. This would be the end of England as an independent nation. The Armada was massive, 130 warships, over 25,000 men, and enough firepower to flatten any navy that stood in its way. But Spain made one fatal mistake: they underestimated Drake. In April 1587, just 1 year before the Armada was set to launch, Drake took the fight directly to Spain. Instead of waiting for the invasion, he launched a preemptive strike on the Spanish port of Cadiz, where much of the Armada's fleet was being assembled. This attack was later called the singeing of the King of Spain's beard. Under the cover of night, Drake and his fleet sailed into the heavily guarded Spanish port and unleashed chaos. They set fire to over 30 Spanish ships, destroyed tons of supplies, and delayed the Armada's invasion by nearly a year. This attack was a major blow to Spain's war plans. But despite this setback, the Spanish Armada was still coming. And in 1588, England would face its greatest battle yet. In July 1588, the Spanish Armada finally set sail for England. It was an unstoppable force, an armada larger than anything England had ever faced. For Philip II, this was destiny. For Elizabeth I, this was survival. And for Francis Drake, this was his greatest test. The English navy was outnumbered and outgunned. But they had one advantage: Drake's tactics. He did not fight Spain's way, he fought his way. Instead of meeting the Armada in a direct naval battle, the English navy used speed and maneuverability. Drake's plan was simple but effective: hit and run, disrupt supply lines, and never let the Armada land. Then came the Battle of Gravelines. Drake launched fire ships, old burning vessels that were sent directly into the Spanish fleet. In the chaos, the English navy attacked relentlessly, using their lighter, faster ships to outmaneuver the giant Spanish galleons. The Spanish were trapped. The battle was brutal, and the Armada was shattered. Then, nature finished the job. A massive storm, later called the Protestant wind, scattered what remained of the Spanish fleet. Many ships sank, others crashed against the shores of Scotland and Ireland, and by the time the survivors limped back to Spain, over half the Armada was gone. England had won the greatest naval battle in its history. And Francis Drake? He was now a living legend. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in world history. It marked the rise of England as a global naval power and the beginning of Spain's decline. And at the heart of it all was one man, Sir Francis Drake, the pirate who saved England. England had stood against the mightiest empire in the world, and won. The Spanish Armada had been crippled, its once invincible fleet shattered by Drake's cunning, Elizabeth's leadership, and England's fierce resistance. This battle was more than just a naval victory, it was a turning point in history. For the first time, Spain's dominance had been challenged. The once unstoppable empire was now weakened, and England was beginning to rise as a new naval superpower. At the center of it all stood Sir Francis Drake. To England, he was a hero, the man who had sailed the world, stolen Spain's gold, and led the charge against the Armada. To Spain, he was a thief, a pirate, a criminal who had defied their empire. But what was the truth? Drake was a man of contradictions. He was a brilliant strategist, but also a ruthless raider. He was a national hero, but also a man who profited from war and destruction. He was a fearless explorer, but also a privateer who took what he wanted. So how should history remember him? Was he a patriot or a pirate? Was he a savior or a thief? Was he England's greatest naval commander, or just a daring outlaw who happened to be on the right side of history? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, wait until you hear about Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of the Caribbean.